As we settle into night, let's gently wander back through time and explore the quiet strength and remarkable resilience of medieval peasants. Their lives were shaped by hardship, yet they carried a courage that glowed softly through even the coldest and darkest nights. These ordinary people, often overlooked in history, managed to survive winters so harsh they tested both body and spirit. Through clever tricks, shared warmth, and an unshakable will to keep going, they created a story of endurance that lives on even now. Before we drift further into their world, if this peaceful journey brings you comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Share it in the comments below. It's always heartwarming to see how far our little community reaches. Now, if you can, dim your lights, settle into a cozy spot, maybe let a soft hum or a gentle fan accompany you, and let's step quietly into tonight's tale. When we imagine medieval life, it's easy to picture shining nights, bustling feasts, or lively markets. But for the peasants who lived far from castles and courtrooms, winter was less a season of festivities and more a yearly challenge. Almost like nature's stern reminder of how fragile life could be. Imagine yourself in a small, humble hut built from wooden sticks and packed with mud. The walls are thin enough that you might hear a bird ruffle its feathers outside. There are no real windows, just an opening covered with stretched animal hide. And as for warmth, there's no cozy argument about the thermostat here. The temperature inside hovers only a little above whatever icy chill waits beyond the door. Nights are especially difficult. Darkness settles in heavily, swallowing the room. The wind moans like a restless spirit, slipping through tiny cracks in the walls. The fire in the hearth struggles and sputters, glowing faintly, warming only the person sitting closest. On the far side of the room, it almost feels as if you're sleeping under the open sky. Clothing offers little comfort. Peasants don't drape themselves in warm furs or thick blankets. They have coarse wool tunics and maybe a cloak that carries a lingering scent of a goat or two. Layering helps, but only just. Beds are often nothing more than sacks filled with straw or reeds, sometimes sprinkled with dry rushes and occasionally accompanied by a few tiny uninvited guests. The cold isn't merely uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Frostbite, illness, and even freezing to death are everyday threats, especially for the young and elderly. Each morning, waking up warm and breathing is a quiet blessing, one worthy of whispered thanks. So surviving winter isn't about staying cozy. It's about resilience. It's about wrapping yourself in every scrap of fabric you own, gathering close to those beside you, sharing warmth with your animals, and whispering a hopeful prayer that you'll greet the sunrise once more. If you ever felt a draft slip through a window in your modern home, medieval peasants would have understood that frustration all too well, though their version was far more dramatic. Their homes weren't just drafty. They were practically welcoming winter inside with open arms. Most peasant houses were built using a method known as wattle and daub, a simple lattice of sticks woven together like a large basket, then coated with a mixture of mud, straw, and yes, even animal dung. It wasn't meant to be unpleasant. It was simply the best and most affordable material available. And for all its ingenuity, it still struggled bravely, but often unsuccessfully, against the sharp bite of winter winds. No matter how carefully the walls were constructed, the cold always seemed to find a way in, slipping through tiny spaces, swirling across the floor, and reminding each family that comfort was a luxury, not a guarantee. Warmth was fleeting. Privacy didn't really exist. But character? That they had in abundance. Roofs of thick thatch appeared charming from afar, but after endless days of rain, frost, and snow, they sagged under the weight. Sometimes they leaked, sending a steady drip into buckets carefully placed beneath. And every now and then, a curious bird or squirrel would find its way inside, tumbling into the room with a flutter that startled both humans and animals alike. Windows, when present, were small and covered with stretched hides or rough shutters. Glass was rare, far too precious for peasants. Even the local lord might only have a tiny pane or two. Peasant families simply hoped the wind wouldn't snatch the hideaway during a winter storm. The floor was often just flattened earth. When it rained or snowed, moisture crept inward, creating muddy patches underfoot. In winter, the ground beneath your feet grew so cold that walking across your own home sometimes felt like crossing a frozen marsh. The chill rose from below, drifted down from the rafters above, and pressed in from every side, a quiet, ever-present reminder of nature's power. But peasants were nothing if not resourceful. They stuffed moss into gaps, pressed rags into cracks, and layered straw along the floor. They brushed fresh mud onto weakening walls and carefully patched holes under the roof. Whatever they had, soft cloth, dry grass, even clumps of wool, became tools in their constant battle to keep the freezing air at bay. Their creativity was their shield, their persistence their warmth. Every small improvement, every stuffed crevice, every added layer became a tiny victory against a relentless winter cold. For medieval peasants, the cold didn't just slip through the walls or glide down from the roof. It also rose quietly from beneath their feet. The floor, little more than packed earth, held the deep chill of winter like a silent reservoir. Sleeping just a thin layer above it meant that the cold crept upward throughout the night, slowly soaking into bones and numbing tired limbs. If you dropped something onto the floor after dark, chances were it wouldn't just be cold. You might find it frozen in place by morning. To soften this harshness, peasants spread straw or dried rushes across the ground. Thick layers helped, offering a fragile barrier between their bodies and the icy earth. But straw flattened quickly underfoot, absorbing moisture and turning damp long before spring arrived. Soon it would grow musty, inviting tiny creatures to make themselves at home. Every step produced a soft crunch, a reminder of how temporary the comfort truly was. Some homes used rushes instead, long, narrow plants gathered in bundles from nearby marshes or riverbanks. These, too, provided insulation, but over time the layers built up, fresh rushes thrown down on top of old ones, never fully cleaned away. Slowly, they formed a sort of living carpet made of decaying plants, flecks of dirt, and the occasional scurrying guest. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival. Beds weren't much of an escape either. The wooden frames, if a family was fortunate enough to have them, held sacks stuffed with straw or hay. These makeshift mattresses were lumpy, uneven, and prone to shifting beneath you as you moved. Sleeping on them meant becoming familiar with the soft rustle of straw beneath your weight, the uneven patches that poked at your ribs, and the tiny fleas that sometimes found their way inside. Tossing and turning wasn't about finding a more comfortable position. It was a quiet dance to keep circulation flowing, to prevent one side of your body from growing too cold. For many, sleep wasn't peaceful. It was simply a pause, a moment of rest between one battle with the cold and the next. Even so, peasants made the best of what they had. Straw provided a touch of warmth. Rushes softened the edges of the night. And crowding together atop these simple beds, sharing breath and closeness, turned a bitter winter into something just a little gentler. Medieval peasants didn't conquer the cold, but they learned to live with it, to soften its bite one small layer at a time. And in those long nights, wrapped in rough blankets and the faint warmth of shared company, they found a way to greet each morning still alive. In a medieval peasant's home, there was one quiet guardian that stood between the family and the icy darkness outside, the hearth. It wasn't grand or elegant. It was simple, often just a small fire pit surrounded by stones, crackling bravely through the long winter nights. But this little fire meant everything. It offered warmth, light, food, and hope, all wrapped into a single flickering glow. Most peasant homes didn't have chimneys, at least not the kind we imagine today. Instead, smoke drifted out through holes in the roof or slipped through the same cracks the wind used to enter. The air inside could grow thick and hazy, leaving eyes watering and lungs heavy. Yet that smoke served a purpose. It kept insects and pests away, filling the space with a rustic kind of protection. The hearth wasn't just a source of heat. It was the heart of the home. Families gathered around at night, sharing stories, murmuring prayers, or quietly staring into the shifting embers as the world outside became swallowed by frost. The fire brought them together, gave them a place to rest their weary bones, and offer a moment of peace after long days spent working the land. Keeping it alive wasn't optional. It was a nightly duty, a responsibility that carried the weight of survival. Letting the fire die meant waking to a freezing house, numb fingers, and the daunting task of sparking a new flame in the cold, still air. Striking flint against steel with trembling hands was no easy task. And in the depths of winter, it could be dangerous. So, before drifting off to sleep, peasants protected the fire carefully. They practiced a method known as banking, covering the glowing embers with a soft layer of ash. Too much ash and the fire smothered, too little and the embers cooled. But just the right amount created a faint, steady warmth that could last until morning. With a gentle prod at dawn, the embers would flare back to life, ready to brighten another day. Everyone in the household took part. Children learned early to tend the fire, their small hands reaching forward to place tiny sticks around the embers. Adults checked the flames constantly, adding peat or wood when needed. Even the elders, with their aching joints and slow steps, often settled near the hearth, keeping a watchful eye through the long, silent hours. Sometimes, despite all precautions, the fire still went out, snuffed by a sudden gust of wind or starved of fuel without anyone noticing. On those mornings, frustration mingled with fear, but the peasants endured, striking again and again until that precious spark returned. The hearth wasn't perfect. It smoked, flickered, and often failed to warm the entire room. But it was a symbol of perseverance, a small, glowing promise that life would continue, even in the harshest winter. And so each night, as the family curled together on their straw beds and listened to the fire whisper and crackle, they found comfort in its gentle glow, a reminder that even in the coldest season, warmth and light still had a place in their world. If there was one fear that quietly lingered in every medieval home during winter, it was this. What if the fire didn't survive the night? Losing the hearth's warmth wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a real danger. A house without a living ember became as cold as the world outside, and rekindling a fire from nothing was slow, difficult, and sometimes impossible in the biting air. Matches didn't exist. Lighters weren't even imaginable. Starting a flame meant crouching in the dim light, striking flint against steel again and again, hoping a spark would settle into the bundle of kindling. The process required patience, steady hands, and a bit of luck, all of which dwindled quickly when your breath was already fogging in the icy room. So families developed ways to protect the fire. Banking it, covering the last glowing coals with a soft blanket of ash, became an evening ritual. If done just right, the embers would rest through the night, hidden but alive, ready to bloom into flames at dawn. If done poorly, the fire would suffocate, leaving only cold stones and disappointment by morning. Every family had its own wisdom, passed down from elders whose winters outnumbered their wrinkles. Some insisted the ash be perfectly dry. Others believed a hint of moisture worked better. Some packed the coals tight. Others left them loose to breathe. These differences became small traditions, stories told while children watched the soft glow disappear under the ash. But even the best methods weren't foolproof. A sharp breeze sneaking through a gap in a wall could extinguish the embers with one careless gust. A curious animal might shuffle too close. A forgotten log might shift in the night. That's why families often took turns staying half awake, rising now and then to check the hearth, nudging the embers gently, listening for the faint crackle that promised warmth. Children old enough to hold a stick earned the responsibility of fire watch, rubbing sleep in their eyes as they shuffled toward the glow. Elders, unable to sleep deeply, often volunteered to keep vigil as well, their calm presence blending into the quiet night. For those sleeping, warmth was light and fleeting. For those tending the fire, the night stretched long and still. But when morning came and the ashes stirred, releasing a spark that caught the kindling, it felt like a small miracle, a whisper of survival, another day granted. Fire banking wasn't about outsmarting winter. It was about buying precious time, holding on to just enough heat to greet the sunrise with hope. Keeping one ember alive was enough to keep a whole family alive. And so, night after night, winter after winter, medieval peasants tended their fragile hearts with devotion, trusting that beneath the soft blanket of ash, something warm would endure. After the evening's careful work, patching cracks, stacking the last of the dry wood, and tucking the pot of stew near the embers, there was a small but solemn ritual before sleep, making sure the hearth would do its quiet duty until morning. It wasn't a single action. It was a cluster of small, practiced moves that families perfected over years of harsh winters. Someone leaned close to the fire and judged the coals by eye and by touch, knowing exactly when to let the flames die back and when to feed them just a little. The hottest coals were nudged together with a stick so they could keep each other breathing. Loose ash was brushed gently around them to form a warm cradle. Each motion was careful, measured. Too brusque and the flame would surge. Too timid and the embers would smother. While one person tended the hearth, others finished the small tasks that mattered. A blanket shaken out and warmed near the lightest heat, a handful of fresh straw fluffed and placed where it would be needed most, a cloak folded to be reached quickly if a child stirred. Even the smallest comfort, an extra wool cap tucked beneath a pillow, felt vital. These moments were quiet and almost reverent. The family moved softly, speaking in low tones so as not to wake babies who had finally drifted to sleep. The room smelled of smoke, warm bread, and straw. It felt protected, as if the careful work of the evening had woven an invisible shield against a night outside. Tending the hearth was also a way of easing worry. Parents remembered old methods, how to smother a flare, how to lift the ash without losing the glow beneath, which piece of wood would burn slow and steady. These little pieces of knowledge were treated like treasures, handed down in whispers and practiced with small, skillful hands. When everything was in its place and the embers lay hidden but alive beneath the ash, the last small checks were made. Doors were pressed tight, window hides fastened, and animals moved where their warmth could be shared best. The heart's quiet promise, kept by ash and patient hands, felt like a promise of morning to come. Then, with the house settled and the embers banked, the family curled together in the warmest corner. They trusted the embers' hidden glow to look after them, and with that trust settled upon their shoulders, they let sleep come, soft, cautious, and a little braver than the night before. In the long, frozen nights of medieval winter, warmth was something precious. So precious that peasants learned to share it in the simplest, most human way possible, by sleeping close together. Not just as families, sometimes with neighbors, and often with animals, too. Personal space wasn't a concept then, only survival was. When the night grew especially bitter, the household gathered in the warmest corner of their single room, arranging themselves like layers in a cozy, slightly chaotic tapestry of arms, legs, cloaks, and blankets. Parents nestled children between them, elders squeezed into safer spots away from the drafts, and anyone extra simply followed the unspoken rule. If there's even a little room, there's room enough. Sleeping alone wasn't just lonely, it was dangerously cold. Body heat was one of the few reliable sources of warmth peasants had, and so they slept side by side, forming a living shield against the frost that pressed through the thin walls. The middle was the warmest place to be, cradled by heat on all sides. Those on the outer edges bore the brunt of the cold, wrapped in layers of rough wool, and hoping their cloaks would hold off the icy air. A shift in sleep or a small turn could cause a chain reaction. Someone too close to the edge might suddenly feel the sting of winter sneaking under their blanket. Beds, when used, were often shared. One large straw mattress supported several bodies at once, its surface rustling softly beneath them. The warmth trapped beneath the blanket slowly spread from person to person, filling the narrow space with gentle, shared heat. Children, with their small bodies and restless legs, would sometimes drift into sleep nestled between two adults. Elders, fragile and precious, were carefully positioned where the warmth was strongest, and if a cousin or neighbor arrived unexpectedly on a bitter night, they were welcomed without hesitation. One more body meant one more thread of warmth woven into the fragile safety of the group. The arrangement wasn't always peaceful. A sudden kick, a shift of weight, or an accidental nudge could wake someone. Soft murmurs filled the night. The quiet rustling of blankets, the faint breathing of animals nearby, and the occasional whisper as someone tried to settle back into a comfortable spot. But even in this crowded closeness, there was a sense of comfort, of being connected, protected, and understood. Winter was harsh, unforgiving, and icy. Yet here, wrapped in blankets and shared warmth, surrounded by familiar breathing and quiet heartbeats, peasants found a fragile peace. They didn't think of it as an inconvenience. They thought of it as life. A gentle, human warmth glowing softly against the cold night. If sharing a bed with siblings sounds difficult, imagine sharing your nightly space with half the barn. For medieval peasants, bringing animals indoors during winter wasn't strange. It was essential. Every warm body mattered. And in the heart of winter, Even a cow's slow, steady breath felt like a blessing. As night fell, cottages transformed into crowded, gently murmuring shelters. Cows settled near the walls, their large bodies emanating a comforting heat. Goats wandered closer to the hearth as they understood its importance, and pigs sprawled wherever they pleased, snorting softly in their sleep. Chickens found little nooks or climbed into the rafters, their feathers rustling like tiny whispers in the dim light. The smells were strong and unmistakable, an earthy mix of straw, animals, and smoke. But for peasants, it was simply the aroma of survival. The warmth these creatures brought was unmistakable. A cow standing close could make the difference between a shivering night and a bearable one. Goats, restless and curious, often edged their way closer still, nudging into blankets or stepping gingerly around sleeping bodies. Having livestock inside also kept them safer. In the dark, hungry animals might wander into nearby fields. Thieves might try to snatch a goat or chicken, or predators lurking in the night could strike. Indoors, the animals are protected, and in turn, they protected their owners by offering their warmth. Of course, sharing space with animals came with its own little adventures. A chicken might decide your shoulder was a perfect perch. A cow's gentle grunt might startle you awake. And stepping on something unpleasant in the darkness was a risk everyone knew too well. But these small inconveniences were worth enduring to make sure the family and their livelihood survived the unforgiving cold. Some animals had favorite spots. Cows, being large and warm, often stayed near the family's sleeping area. Goats took advantage of their nimbleness, weaving their way into the coziest corners. Chickens sought higher ground. Pigs cared little for neatness and sprawled wherever the floor felt right. The nights were alive with soft sounds, low grunts, gentle breathing, the rustle of straw, and the steady crackle of the fire. Despite the crowding, these sounds offered a sense of companionship. You were not alone in the fight against winter's cold grip. You were surrounded by life, animals and family alike, each sharing warmth, each easing the icy silence. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't clean, but it was warm. And in the medieval world, warmth was everything. Together, humans and animals. Peasants wove a small circle of life inside fragile walls, defined the winter with shared breath and shared presence. In the medieval world, winter clothing wasn't about fashion or elegance. It was about sheer survival. Peasants didn't dress to impress. They dressed to endure. Each layer was a quiet act of courage against the bitter cold. Each garment a barrier between life and frost. Their day began with a simple linen undertunic, often coarse and rough against the skin. Over that went a woolen tunic, thick, heavy, and rarely washed. If fortune allowed, another tunic might be layered on top, forming a soft armor of woven warmth. Leggings sagged at the knees, cloaks were draped over shoulders, and if a family owned a sheepskin, it was cherished like treasure, warm, weighty, and unmistakably fragrant. Boots were luxuries few could afford. Instead, peasants wrapped their feet in scraps of old cloth or strips of worn fabric, tucking them into wooden clogs. These makeshift shoes offered little protection, but they were better than walking barefoot on frozen ground. On especially cold nights, more rags were added, creating thick bundles that trapped precious warmth. Clothing often went unwashed through the winter months. Streams froze, water turned scarce, and drying garments was nearly impossible. But this lack of washing had an unexpected blessing. Over time, The layers of dirt, sweat, and natural oils create a seal within the fibers, making the clothing more wind-resistant. It was, in its own way, an accidental but effective form of insulation. Hats, scarves, and gloves were treasures. A woolen cap could protect a person from losing heat too quickly. Scarves were wrapped around faces to warm the breath, and mittens, usually patched and worn thin, helped prevent fingers from stiffening in the cold. Children were bundled so thoroughly they could hardly move, transformed into small, waddling bundles of wool and linen. Each layer was added with care, ensuring that every bit of warmth was preserved. Parents understood how fragile young bodies were in the cold, and did everything they could to keep their little ones safe. Style didn't matter. Cleanliness didn't matter. What mattered was life, preserving it through the harshest months with every thread, every scrap, every stitch they could gather. Peasants carried their warmth on their backs, one layer at a time. The moment someone thought they had sealed the last draft, a new chill would sneak through a place no one had noticed. A sudden gust of wind could extinguish a precious ember, rattle the shutters, or send a faint shiver across the room. But bit by bit, handful by handful, peasants built barriers against the cold. Their homes were never perfectly insulated, yet they held just enough warmth for survival. Each patched wall, every stuffed crevice, every careful repair told a quiet story of resilience. In the dim firelight, surrounded by mud-lined walls and bundled in cloaks, peasants trusted their work and each other. Even as winter pressed its frosty fingers against their homes, they found ways to push back, creating, with their bare hands and ingenuity, a small refuge in a world of ice. In the depths of winter, when the night stretched endlessly and the cold pressed in like a silent tide, medieval peasants learned that survival sometimes meant taking turns with sleep itself. Rest wasn't something everyone enjoyed at once. It was carefully shared. Homes were too fragile to hold warmth for long. Fires needed tending constantly, and drafts slipped in whenever they pleased. So families developed an unspoken rhythm. While some slept, others stayed awake, guarding the fire and keeping the cold at bay. This wasn't a strict schedule. There were no bells or commands, just instinct, necessity, and quiet cooperation. A mother might stay awake after others drifted off, gently adjusting the fire. A father might rise in the middle of the night to add wood or peat. Older children, proud to help, learned to poke at glowing embers with care, watching for the soft sigh of flame returning. Meanwhile, those who slept did so lightly. Straw rustled beneath them, the warmth of bodies mingling under thin blankets. The shifting glow of the hearth flickered across the room, casting gentle shadows that danced along the walls. Then, as fatigue pressed in, the watchers would quietly nudge another family member awake. Someone else would take their place at the fire's side, rubbing their eyes, pulling a cloak tighter, and settling into the slow, steady task of keeping the embers alive. It wasn't glamorous work. The night felt long, and the quiet could be eerie. Outside, the wind whispered against the walls, or rattled the shutters like a distant, restless spirit. Sometimes animals stirred, shifting on the floorboards, and sometimes the only sound was the faint crackle of the fire fighting to stay alive. But this system worked. By rotating sleep, no one froze while the others dreamed. The fire stayed breathing, its fragile heart protected by hands that refused to let it die. Even young children participated, learning early how vital the hearth was. Elders often stayed up longer, their bodies too stiff to lie down for long, and their experience too valuable to waste. It wasn't restful, not fully, but it was a delicate dance of duty and care. Each person carried a piece of the night, ensuring the others remained safe. And when dawn finally crept across the horizon, pale and cold, everyone felt they had earned its light. This shared vigilance was more than survival. It was unity. It was the understanding that winter could not be faced alone, that warmth, protection, and even sleep had to be given and received in turn. And so, through dark hours and drifting snow, medieval families stayed awake for one another, weaving a fragile chain of endurance through the night, one ember at a time. On the coldest winter nights, even something as simple as breathing had to be done with care. Medieval peasants knew that the wrong breath, too deep, too fast, too cold, could weaken the body and invite sickness. So they adapted, turning each inhale into a quiet act of preservation. Breathing through the mouth pulled icy air straight into the chest, chilling the lungs and tightening the throat. Illnesses spread quickly in winter, and a single cold breath could turn into days of coughing, fever, and fear. And so, peasants learned to breathe slowly, gently, and always through the nose. The air warmed slightly on its way in, making winter a little less harsh on the fragile human body. Parents taught children early. Close your mouth, breathe softly. It became a nightly ritual. Whisper reminders passed from bed to bed as the family settled beneath their layers of blankets and cloaks. Even the smallest ones learned quickly. Winter did not forgive careless breaths. To help warm the air, many slept with bits of cloth wrapped around their mouths and noses. Cloaks were pulled up to the cheeks, shawls tucked under the chin, and rough-woven scarves draped over the face. By morning, these fabrics grew damp with breath, clinging softly to the skin, but they offered a precious barrier against the unforgiving cold. Those lying closest to fire breathed more comfortably, the air tinged with warmth and smoke. Those farther away curled deeper into the blankets, inhaling slowly to keep the cold from settling into their chests. With each measured breath, they preserved a little more heat, a little more strength. Even during the day, people moved carefully, mindful not to gasp when stepping outside. The shock of icy air could steal breath from their lungs, leaving them coughing and clutching their cloaks tighter. Slow breathing became part of winter itself, woven into every moment like a quiet rhythm of survival. In the dim glow of the firelight, families drifted asleep, their shallow breaths rising in small, pale clouds. It looked almost peaceful, the kind of soft, steady breathing you might see in a room full of dreamers. But each breath was also a decision, a gentle act of defiance against the cold. Winter taught them to breathe with intention, to move softly, to protect themselves with even the smallest habits. And so, tucked beneath their blankets, nestled beside loved ones and animals, medieval peasants breathed their way through the harshest nights, slowly, quietly, one warm inhale at a time. When winter sank its teeth deep into the land, medieval peasants relied on more than cloaks and embers to stay warm. They turned to one of the simplest, most reliable sources of heat: food. Not just any food, but heavy, filling meals that lingered in the belly and kept the body working through the long, frozen night. They understood, even without science, that a full stomach meant a warmer body. Digestion created heat, slow, steady, comforting warmth that carried them through hours of darkness. So before settling in for the night, families gathered near the hearth to share a meal that was less about flavor and more about survival. Stews thick with root vegetables, turnips, onions, parsnips bubbled softly in the pot. Grains like barley and oats turned into hearty porridge, dense and warm. Sturdy loaves of coarse bread filled empty spaces. And if fortune blessed a family, perhaps after a feast day or a good harvest, there might be a bit of salted meat stirred into the pot, adding rich flavor and strength. These were meals made for endurance. Heavy, wholesome, and simple. Eating wasn't hurried. Families savored each bite, not because it tasted luxurious, but because they knew how precious the warmth would be later. Children were encouraged to finish their bowls, even if they wrinkled their noses at the vegetables. A full belly keeps the cold away. Parents would murmur, words passed down through generations. Fatty foods were especially cherished in winter. A small bit of lard stirred into the pot or spread lightly on bread brought lasting warmth. It filled the body with slow-burning energy, creating a cozy heat that lingered long after the fire dimmed. Of course, sleeping after such heavy meals sometimes meant strange, vivid dreams, visions stirred by a stomach working overtime in the cold. But even those dreams were a small price to pay for a night of relative warmth. And so, with bellies full and cloaks wrapped tight, families settled in for night. The warmth of dinner spread through their bodies like a gentle glow, fighting the cold from within while the hearth guarded them from without. It was a simple ritual, repeated night after night. Eat, warm up, survive. A rhythm as old as winter itself. Food wasn't just nourishment. It was comfort, protection, and hope. Served in a humble wooden bowl beneath the soft crackle of the evening fire. Long before electric blankets or warm water bottles existed, medieval peasants found comfort in two unlikely winter companions: hay boxes and heated stones. Simple tools, born from necessity, that brought gentle warmth to their chilly nights. The hay box was a clever creation, a wooden box lined generously with soft, insulating hay. By day, families used it to keep their cooked food warm. A pot of stew tucked inside after cooking would stay hot for hours, wrapped snugly in nature's insulation, in a world without ovens or reliable heat. This little box felt almost magical, but hay was good for more than warming food. Peasants soon realized it could hold other kinds of heat, too. As night approached, someone, usually a child with nimble fingers or a patient elder, would choose a smooth stone from beside the hearth. This stone was pushed deep into the fire, where it sat glowing softly beneath the flames. Once it absorbed enough heat, the stone was carefully pulled out with tongs or sticks. Too hot, and it could scorch a hand. Too cold, and it wouldn't last until midnight. The timing had to be just right. Then came the wrapping. The warm stone was swaddled in cloth, tucked into sacks, or nestled inside a clay pot. Peasants carried it to bed like a small treasure, slipping it under blankets or into the hay-filled mattress. As they laid down, the lingering warmth seeped through, easing stiff muscles and offering a gentle, comforting glow beneath the cold air. These heated stones didn't stay warm all night, but for those first few precious hours, when the world was its coldest, they offered relief, a moment of peace. A small, personal sun tucked beneath layers of fabric and straw. The stones came with risks, of course. A poorly wrapped one might scorch blankets. A careless drop could crack the floor or bruise a foot. But most families perfected the technique through years of winter practice. Together, the hay box and heated stone became quiet guardians. The hay box kept supper warm. The stone kept sleepers warm. Both worked without flame, without noise, just the soft, steady release of heat in a home that needed every bit it could gather. There was something almost tender about these small rituals, warming the stone, wrapping it with care, placing it at the foot of the bed. It was a gesture of love in a world ruled by cold, a way of saying, asterisk, rest now. You're safe for a while, asterisk. And so, with a warm bed and the soft crackle of the fire in the distance, peasants drifted to sleep, wrapped in blankets, nestled in straw. Comforted by something as humble as a heated stone, they found their own tiny slice of warmth amid winter's icy reach. In every medieval peasant home, the fire was more than a tool, it was a lifeline. And when it came to sleeping, where you rested your head often depended on how close you could safely be to that precious source of warmth. The hearth sat at the center of the room, glowing quietly through the night. Its light flickered against the walls, painting gentle shadows that wavered with every shifted flame. This small circle of heat was where life gathered, and so families arranged themselves around it with care. Those most vulnerable, infants, the elderly, anyone ill or weak, were given the warmest spots. They curled closest to fire's gentle glow, wrapped in layers of wool and straw. Their bodies, fragile in the cold, needed every bit of warmth the hearth could offer. Parents and older children formed rings around them, laying slightly farther back. These layers of sleepers acted like insulation, sharing body heat and blocking the harsh drafts that slipped through the cracks in the walls. Each person helped protect the next. It was a quiet, unspoken arrangement, a natural formation shaped by love and instinct. Yet sleeping by the fire was not, without its risks. Rest too close, and a person might wake to find their cloak smoldering or their hair warmed a bit too enthusiastically by a wandering spark. Rest too far, and the bitter cold crept in again, nibbling at toes and fingertips. Everyone learned to find a careful balance, a sweet spot between warmth and safety. The fire's warmth didn't spread evenly. It washed over those in front, bathing them in gentle heat, while others behind them received only fading remnants. This created a strange kind of winter choreography. People shifted positions through the night, rolling over, inching nearer, or adjusting blankets to catch a little more warmth from the hearth's soft glow. Animals joined in this nightly gathering, too. A dog might curl at someone's feet, sharing its warmth. Chickens perched quietly near the stones, enjoying the gentle heat. Sometimes a goat edged closer until its soft breath brushed the sleeping face. And though startling at first, it was often welcomed. Every warm creature made the long night a little kinder. Throughout the darkness, the fire crackled softly, its embers glowing like tiny stars gathered on the ground. Each pop inside of the flames promised life, reminding everyone that warmth, however fragile, still existed within these humble walls. And there, in the hush of shared sleep, surrounded by loved ones and lit by the soft breath of the fire, medieval peasants found comfort despite the winter pressing heavily outside. The hearth was more than heat. It was safety, love, and hope gently glowing in the heart of the night. In the medieval world, no one truly survived winter alone. Cold had a way of reminding everyone, quietly but firmly, that life was stronger when shared. And so villages became more than clusters of small homes. They became woven communities of people who watched over one another through the darkest months of the year. Every household fought its own battles, tending fires, patching walls, warming meals, but the village as a whole remained deeply connected. If the smoke from a neighbor's hearth stopped rising one morning, people noticed. If someone hadn't stepped outside for a day or two, others grew concerned. Winter sharpened the senses and strengthened bonds, turning ordinary watchfulness into an act of care. Not every watcher was strong or young. Elders, often too frail for fieldwork, observed the village from their doorways or windows. Children ran between homes delivering messages or small bundles of firewood. People who could no longer lift heavy tools still offered something priceless: presence and attention. Sometimes a family's fire would go out. A storm might blow through the night, snuffing the embers. Wood might run low. Illness might keep someone from tending the flames. And when that happened, the darkness that filled the home was more than physical. It was dangerous. But neighbors didn't hesitate. Someone would bring a glowing coal wrapped in wool or tucked into a clay pot, carrying it carefully through the icy air. Others might open their door, offering a warm corner to sleep in until dawn. Yes, it meant more bodies in a crowded space. Yes, it meant sharing precious warmth. But survival required generosity, and peasants understood this deeply. Food, too, became a shared responsibility. During especially harsh winters, villages would combine small portions of grain, dried vegetables, or salted meat to create communal meals. It wasn't abundance. It was a fragile, collective hope. Everyone gave what they could, trusting that the kindness would return to them when needed. Even the smallest gestures carried weight. A loaf of bread left quietly at someone's door. A few rushes for bedding. A warm cloak lent to a neighbor making the long walk to collect water. These acts, though modest, helped bind the community together like threads in a heavy winter blanket. Of course, disputes still existed. Arguments over fields, debts, or wandering animals didn't simply vanish. Yet when the air turned bitter and survival hung in the balance, grievances softened. Winter did not care who was right or wrong, only who was warm enough to endure. In the heart of winter silence, the village breathed as one. Families tending fires, children fetching wood, elders keeping watch, neighbors sharing what little they had. The cold may have been relentless, but so was a compassion that flickered from home to home, like a chain of small but steady flames stretching through the snow. And through this shared warmth, peasants found a deeper strength, a reminder that even in harshness, humanity shines brightest when people hold each other up, one quiet act of kindness at a time. When winter wrapped the world in silence, medieval peasants found warmth in the most unexpected place: each other's presence. Not just in the practical sense, sharing fires, sharing blankets, but in the soft glow of companionship that brightened even the longest nights. Evenings were quiet but rarely lonely. After a long day of trudging through snow, tending animals, or repairing worn-out tools, families gathered close around the hearth. The fire became the heart of the room, its crackling voice steady and comforting, while everything else faded into softer tones. Children sat bundled together, wrapped in woolen cloaks or thick blankets, whispering little stories or playing simple games scratched into the dirt floor. Their laughter was subdued but warm, rising and falling with the rhythm of the flames. Pets curled beside them, dogs, cats, even the occasional wandering chicken, adding their soft warmth to the group. Adults spent these hours mending clothing, patching holes in cloaks, sharpening tools, or preparing simple meals. There was no rush. Winter slowed everyone down, turning nightly chores into calm rituals done by the fire's flickering light. The older members of the family often told stories, legends, memories, or gentle lessons wrapped in tales of the past. Some nights, neighbors dropped by, not for celebration, but for comfort. A shared candle, a warm corner by the hearth, or a cup of hot broth could mean everything during harsh weather. People spoke softly, forming a circle of quiet companionship, their shadows swaying gently across the walls. Silence wasn't feared. It was part of winter's music. Occasionally, someone hummed a tune. Not loud, not lively, just a soft, steady melody that drifted to home like a warm blanket itself. These simple songs soothed restless children, calmed tired parents, and filled the dark with sense of peace. Even bedtime was shared. Families arranged themselves carefully, stacking warmth like layers of armor against the cold. Sleep came slowly but sweetly, surrounded by the soft breathing of loved ones, the muted crackle of burning wood, and the distant hush of the wind outside. In these long months, companionship wasn't just comforting, it was necessary. Winter tested the body, but loneliness tested the spirit. And so, peasants held tight to one another, weaving warmth from closeness, stories, and shared quiet moments. For though their walls were thin and the cold unrelenting, inside those modest homes lived a different kind of warmth, one created not by fire alone, but by hearts gathered together, facing the winter as one. As winter lingered like a long, cold visitor, medieval families discovered that true warmth didn't come only from fire. It came from the ways they cared for one another. In the heart of the coldest season, small, thoughtful rituals carried them through the dark. One of the most cherished rituals took place just before bedtime, sharing warmth through touch. Not romantic, not dramatic, simply human comfort. Parents wrapped their arms around shivering children. Grandparents held little ones close, their seasoned hands gently rubbing tiny backs to stir warmth. Even siblings leaned against each other, pooling heat like animals in a nest. The night air grew sharp as the fire dimmed, so these moments of gentle closeness mattered deeply. A hand held under a blanket, a head resting on a shoulder, a shared cloak pulled tight around two bodies. Each act was soft but powerful. Survival wasn't always loud or heroic. Sometimes it was quiet, slow, almost tender. Before sleep, some families warmed their blankets by the dying fire. They hung them close, not too close, and let the fabric soak in whatever heat it could. Then, wrapping the warm blanket around themselves felt like being embraced by the hearth one last time before the cold reclaimed the room. Mothers tucked children in carefully, smoothing rough linen sheets and adding extra straw beneath their backs. Fathers checked the embers, pushing them together and whispering a small hope that the fire would still be alive when dawn arrived. Everyone played their part. Another winter habit was sharing stories, not elaborate tales, but simple reflections of the day. Someone might mention how beautiful the frost looked on the fields, or how the wind whistled like a flute through the trees. These soft observations helped ease the mind, turning fear of the winter night into a kind of gentle curiosity. Even prayers took on a more tender tone. Families murmured quiet wishes for warmth, for strength, for protection. These nightly words wrapped their spirits in comfort the same way blankets wrapped their bodies. And then, slowly, each person settled in. The home darkened. The fire's glow softened. The world outside fell silent once more. But inside, warmth lingered. In the shared breaths, in the rustling of straw, in the closeness of people who refused to face the darkness alone. Winter may have ruled the land, but within these small homes, love ruled the night. Every night ended the same way, with a deep sigh, a final shift under blankets, and the steady rhythm of peaceful sleep spreading from one person to the next, like warmth passing gently from heart to heart. Winter had a way of slowing the world to a hush, and medieval peasants knew that their homes, humble as they were, needed protection from more than just cold. During the harshest nights, the wind didn't merely whistle, it prowled. It slipped under doors, crawled through cracks, and carried with it strange sounds that stirred the imagination. But peasants were used to these nightly whispers. They understood that the winter world was alive in its own quiet way. Sometimes, the wind howled across the rooftops, bending the thatch and rattling the wooden shutters. It could sound like distant voices or lonely cries. Children, startled by the noises, would burrow deeper into their blankets, clutching a sibling or parent for comfort. And each time, an adult would gently soothe them, murmuring that it was only the wind, or perhaps the winter spirits passing by. Roofs creaked under the weight of snow. Walls groaned softly as the cold tightened their wooden frames. Even the ground seemed to sigh as frost spread through it. These sounds weren't frightening the peasants. They were reminders that the world outside was shifting, settling, and enduring winter just as they were. Homes weren't silent inside, either. As temperatures dropped, were contracted, popping and snapping with sharp little cracks. Straw in the beds rustled when someone moved. Animals snorted or shuffled in their sleep. The fire hissed, its embers glowing like tiny watchful eyes in the dark. Every sound became part of winter's music. Peasants didn't fear these noises. They listened to them. They learned to distinguish the normal groans of a settling roof from the warning creak of a beam that needed repair. They could tell the difference between snow sliding gently off the thatch and a branch falling somewhere in the forest. Their ears were always alert, even in sleep. And so, during the coldest nights, someone often remained half awake, not fully alert, but resting in a light sleep, ready to rise if a strange noise hinted at danger, an animal prowling too close, a shutter blown open, or a roof weakened by ice. It was a quiet kind of vigilance, born from long winters and practical wisdom. Yet even with these nightly sounds, the home remained a cocoon of safety. The murmurs of the wind only made the warmth inside feel sweeter. The creaking walls reminded families of the shelter they still had, and as long as the fire glowed even faintly, there was nothing to fear. Wrapped in blankets, surrounded by loved ones and listening to winter's gentle conversation outside, peasants drifted into sleep. The night may have been full of strange noises, but inside their modest homes, they rested with a peaceful knowledge that they were protected by warmth, by walls, and by one another. In the deep quiet of winter, medieval peasants learned to depend on more than blankets and fires to stay warm. They turned to simple, steady movement, gentle exercises done right before bed or in the dim hours of dawn. These weren't strenuous workouts or anything resembling modern exercise. They were soft, careful motions meant to coax warmth into cold bodies. Before lying down for the night, many people stretched their limbs slowly, loosening stiff joints and encouraging blood to flow. They rolled their shoulders, bent their knees, or rubbed their arms and hands until the numbness faded. Children often copied the motions, giggling quietly as they mimicked the adults. Some families walked small circles inside their homes, pacing around the hearth until they felt their feet and fingers tingle with returning heat. Others bounced lightly on the balls of their feet, shook out their arms, or even hugged themselves tightly to capture body warmth. These simple movements stirred life into chilled muscles and helped prepare the body for the long, still hours ahead. Rubbing hands together was practically instinct, soft friction turning into gentle warmth. Parents sometimes rubbed their children's hands and feet for them, especially when little fingers went pale from the cold. The rhythmic motion, combined with the glow of the fire nearby, helped ease the sting of winter's bite. Even the act of preparing the bed became a warming ritual. Turning the straw, fluffing it, or smoothing it out required small bursts of motion that encouraged the body to stay warm. Peasants weren't thinking of exercise. They were simply living, and survival naturally shaped their habits. Early in the morning, before stepping outside, people repeated many of these motions. They warmed their hands before opening the door, stretched their backs before lifting tools, and rubbed their arms beneath their cloaks to brace themselves for cold waiting outside. These gentle exercises weren't just practical, they were comforting. They gave people a moment to gather themselves, a brief pause before surrendering to the cold or settling into rest. Movement brought warmth. Warmth brought calm, and calm brought the possibility of sleep. Even animals understood this rhythm. Dogs circled their sleeping spots. Cats kneaded straw with their paws. Goats shifted and stretched before lying down. All life, whether human or animal, embraced movement as a small, natural shield against winter. So in the stillness of night, after soft steps and quiet stretches, peasants finally settled into their beds. Their limbs carried the lingering warmth of motion, their breath steady, their bodies calm. And as they curled into the safety of their blankets, the world outside continued its cold, whispering watch, unbothered, unchanged, but held at bay for just a little longer. On the coldest winter nights, sleep did not always come easily. Medieval peasants understood that the deeper and more peaceful the rest, the stronger they would feel in the morning. So they created small nighttime habits. Quiet rituals meant to calm the body, soothe the mind, and invite sleep gently into their homes. One of the simplest rituals was the art of settling the room. Before lying down, families lowered their voices, moved more quietly, and dimmed the fire until only a soft glow remained. The gentle light told the body that the day was ending, and it was time to drift into rest. Even children understood this unspoken rule. Night was a time for whispering, not play. Another habit was listening to the fire. Its soft crackle, the occasional pop of burning wood, and the warm hum of the embers created a natural lullaby. People became comforted by these sounds, letting them wash away the stresses of the day. The fire's voice was steady, familiar, and safe. Its rhythm a reminder that warmth still lived within the home. Some families practiced quiet, soothing mindfulness without ever calling it that. They focused on their breathing, letting each inhale grow steady and warm. A slow, calm breath could relax tense muscles and ease the cold that clung to their bones. Breathing became a small act of control in a world ruled by winter. Others found peace through soft thoughts. Before sleep, they recalled small blessings, a warm meal, a sturdy roof, a moment of laughter shared earlier. These gentle reflections ease the mind, helping it release the worries of the harsh season. Even a simple memory of sunshine from months ago could bring comfort. Elders often offered whispered advice. Clear your thoughts before closing your eyes. Let the fire hold your worries, rest your heart, so your body can rest too. Their words, spoken in low tones, carried wisdom from countless winters past. Children relied on touch and closeness for comfort. A hand on a parent's arm, a sibling curled close, or a shared blanket offered reassurance that they were safe. The warmth of another body worked better than any lullaby. Some nights, people fell asleep to the soft sound of animals settling nearby. The gentle breathing of a dog, the rustle of chickens, or the steady sigh of a tired goat created a peaceful soundtrack. Simple noises reminding them that life continued quietly through the night. And so, with soft breaths, warm bodies, dim light, and minds slowly unclenching from the day, peasants slipped into sleep. Winter still pressed against the walls, but inside, calmness grew, layer by layer, until the cold felt distant and sleep finally wrapped around them like a soft, welcoming cloak. In the heart of winter, sleep didn't always last the whole night. Medieval peasants often woke long before dawn, not because they wanted to, but because the cold had its own way of nudging them awake. What they experienced was something we now call segmented sleep, though to them, it was simply the natural rhythm of winter nights. After a few hours of rest, people often stirred. The fire had burned low, blankets cooled, and the night air crept across their skin like a thin, icy veil. But waking in the middle of the night wasn't frightening. In fact, it felt strangely peaceful, like drifting onto a quiet shore before falling back into the sea of sleep. During these wakeful moments, families moved softly. Someone would rise to tend the fire, adding a small log or stirring the embers until they glowed brighter. The gentle scraping of wood, the whisper of flames returning, these sounds became part of the night's routine. Others stayed in bed, lying quietly beneath their blankets. They whispered small conversations, shared hushed thoughts, or simply listened to the night. Some used the time to reflect, offering a quiet prayer or thinking about the next day's tasks. The darkness, far from being frightening, felt like a safe space for slow thoughts and soft breaths. Parents sometimes used these moments to check on their children, making sure they were warm enough. They tucked blankets more tightly, shifted sleeping infants closer, or shared their own warmth when a little one stirred from the cold. For those who struggle with winter aches, stiff backs, sore joints, this middle of the night pause was a natural time to stretch, rub tired muscles, or adjust their bedding. Small movements restored comfort and helped them ease back into restful sleep. Animals inside the home shifted too. A dog lifted its head, listened, then settled again. Chickens rustled in their corners. The quiet noises of nighttime companionship were soothing, reminding everyone that they were surrounded by life, not alone in the darkness. Sometimes the whole house rested in a gentle half-sleep, awake enough to sense the world, yet still wrapped in warmth and calm. And after a short while, as the fire regained its glow and the cold softened, people drifted back into their second sleep, deeper and warmer than the first. This rhythm, sleep, wake, sleep again, felt natural, almost comforting. It fit the winter's slow heartbeat, embracing both rest and reflection. Medieval peasants didn't fight these wakeful moments. They accepted them as part of winter's quiet dance. And so, in the hush between midnight and dawn, families found a delicate balance, tending the hearth, tending each other, and letting sleep return in its own gentle time. When morning finally crept across the horizon, medieval peasants didn't wake to alarms, sunlight-filled rooms, or the comforting hum of a warm house. Instead, dawn arrived slowly, first as a faint gray glow, then as soft light slipping through cracks in the walls or around the heavy wooden shutters. The house was often colder than it had been in the middle of the night. The fire, even if carefully tended, had weakened again. The remaining embers glowed faintly, like tired little stars trying their best to hold on. The first person awake, usually someone accustomed to early rising, would shuffle toward the hearth to coax the fire back to life. Breath hung in the air like mist with each exhale. Blankets rustled as others stirred, hesitant to leave the small island of warmth they had created during the night. No one rushed. Mornings were quiet, slow, and gentle, because the cold insisted on it. Children woke like sleepy birds, bundled so tightly they could barely move. They blinked against the pale light, their hair tangled, their cheeks flushed from the night's chill. The first instinct was always to gather closer to the fire, drawing knees to their chest, letting the warmth thaw their fingers and toes. The morning routine revolved around simple survival: rekindling flames, checking animals, breaking ice to fetch water, and preparing warm porridge or broth. Even these small tasks required patience and steady hands. A single wrong move, splitting with too fast, slipping on frozen ground, could lead to injury, and there was no luxury of resting when survival depended on everyone contributing. But there was beauty in these mornings, too. The sound of the fire cracking softly, the smell of warm bread or simmering stew from a pot left resting overnight, the comforting routine of familiar footsteps and muted voices. Even the cold, as harsh as it was, brought a strange clarity. Every breath felt crisp. Every movement felt meaningful. Outside, the world sparkled under layers of frost. Fields, trees, and roofs looked as though they had been dusted with silver powder. Smoke from neighboring homes curled quietly into the pale sky, a sign that others, too, had survived another long winter night. Despite the challenges, mornings carried a sense of gratitude. Each sunrise meant they had made it. One more night conquered, one more step toward spring. And as they bundled up to face the day's work, they carried that quiet triumph with them. Winter was relentless, yes, but medieval peasants were even more determined. With each dawn, they gathered their strength, shared their warmth, and moved forward together. One careful breath, one glowing ember at a time. As the morning settled in and the first tasks of the day began, medieval peasants relied heavily on routine. Those small, steady patterns that helped life feel predictable, even when the world outside was harsh and unforgiving. After tending to the fire and warming their hands, they turned their attention to something equally important: checking their homes for any signs of trouble from the long, icy night. Winter had a way of testing every corner of a medieval hut. Walls could crack from the cold, letting in thin, sneaky drafts that stole warmth. Roofs could shift under heavy snow, creating new leaks that hadn't been there the day before. Even the doors, simple wooden slabs secured by handmade latches, could freeze in place, requiring careful tugging and gentle persuasion to budge. Peasants learned to move slowly and thoughtfully through their homes in the early hours, feeling for cold patches of air with the back of their hands, listening for the faint whistle of wind threading its way through a gap, or spotting fresh frost where it didn't belong. Every discovery became a small task to be handled before breakfast. Straw was gathered from bundles near the wall and pressed into cracks. Moss, dry and thick, made a surprisingly good seal in tighter spaces. Sometimes someone would take a little mud mixed with straw and smear it carefully over a weakened section of the wall, an early morning reminder that the house itself was a living project, never truly finished, always needing care. The roof received special attention, too. A sagging patch of thatch meant climbing a short ladder and pushing snow off with a broom, or with a gloved hand if no broom existed. A wet roof was a dangerous roof, and no one wanted to wake at night to the sound of dripping or, worse, the slow groan of a roof giving way. Even the animals had to be checked. A cow might have shifted too close to the wall and created a new draft. Chickens could kick straw aside, exposing cold earth underneath. Goats, ever curious, might have tugged at a part of the house they shouldn't have. Each small disruption was fixed quietly and without complaint, woven into the rhythm of the morning. These repairs weren't dramatic or glamorous. They were simple acts, the kind done with cold fingers and a still sleepy mind. But they were essential little stitches that kept the household together through winter's long tests. And as each problem was found and fixed, there was comfort in the routine. These small duties reminded peasants that they still had control over something, even when the weather felt enormous and unforgiving. It was a quiet kind of resilience, one patch at a time. By the time the sun rose higher and the sky brightened into pale gold, the home felt safer again. The fire crackled with more confidence. The walls stood firm. The cold stayed outside a little better than before. And with that, the family could finally turn toward the day ahead, knowing their shelter, humble as it was, had survived another night and were whole for another one still. As the morning grew brighter and the home felt a little more secure, medieval peasants shifted their focus to one of the most important parts of winter survival, preparing themselves for the cold day ahead. Dawn might have offered light, but it didn't offer warmth. The air outside remained sharp and biting, and every chore waiting beyond the doorway demanded careful preparation. Getting dressed wasn't a quick or casual task. It was a slow, layering ritual, performed with the quiet seriousness of people who understood that what they wore could mean the difference between returning home safely or not at all. First came the base layer, the linen shirt, stiff from cold and often not entirely clean. It felt chilly at first touch, but the fabric warmed gradually against the skin. Over that went a woolen tunic, heavier and scratchier, its familiar weight settling like a protective shield. Extra layers were added depending on the day. Another tunic, a spare cloak, a patched-up vest that had been mended too many times to count. Leg coverings were tugged on next. Some wore woolen hose, while others wrapped rough cloth strips around their legs to trap heat. Feet were swaddled in rags or old bits of fabric before being tucked into wooden clogs or worn leather shoes. These weren't perfect solutions, but they offer at least some protection from a frozen ground waiting outside. A thick cloak or cape was the final touch, fastened with a simple pin or tied tightly around the neck. Hoods were pulled up. Scarves, if a family had them, were wrapped around faces. Mittens, usually made of scraps or old wool, were slipped over hands still stiff from the night's chill. Each piece of clothing carried a certain comfort. Familiar fabric stitched by familiar hands, worn year after year, patched with memories. Even the roughness of wool or the heaviness of a cloak had a kind of reassurance. It reminded them they'd faced winters before and survived. Getting ready wasn't just about warmth. It was about mindset. The act of dressing was a quiet preparation for the long list of chores awaiting them. Feeding the animals, gathering firewood, hauling water, checking the fields, repairing fences. All of it had to be done regardless of weather or temperature. Before stepping outside, many peasants linger for a moment near the fire, letting its gentle heat soak into their layers. Parents adjusted scarves on their children, tugging hoods down snugly, smoothing hair and wiping sleepy eyes. A few deep breaths steadied them for the cold. Then, finally, they opened the door. A rush of icy air swept in like a greeting from winter itself. Frost glistened on the ground, shimmering in the early light. Breath formed soft clouds. Everything felt quiet and still, as though the world held its own breath. And wrapped in layers of wool, cloth, and determination, the family stepped out together, ready to face the frozen day ahead, one careful step at a time. Once dressed and prepared, medieval peasants stepped outside into a world transformed by winter. The cold didn't just linger in the air. It wrapped around everything like a silent, icy cloak. Every surface, every breath, every movement carried winter's unmistakable touch. The first chore of nearly every morning was tending to the animals. Livestock weren't just animals. They were lifelines. Their warmth, their milk, their strength, all of it kept families alive through the harshest months. So before anything else, peasants checked on their animals with the same care they gave their own children. The barn or animal shelter, if the family had one, was often just a simple lean-to or a small extension of the home. Even so, stepping inside offered a different kind of warmth. The comforting smell of hay, the soft breath of cows, the quiet rustling of goats or sheep, all of it created a pocket of life in the frozen world outside. Water was always the first challenge. Buckets left overnight froze solid, and animals drank nothing but slush unless someone broke the icy layer again and again. Peasants cracked the frozen surface with wooden sticks or short tools, each strike sending tiny shards flying like crystals. Sometimes the entire bucket had to be warmed near the fire to loosen the ice. Feed came next. Hay was brought out in generous armfuls, its dry fragrance drifting into the frigid air. For animals that relied on grain, small cloth sacks were shaken carefully to portion out enough of the day, balancing the need to feed them with the need to stretch dwindling supplies. The animals responded with quiet gratitude, soft lowing, gentle nudges, the rasping sound of chewing. In the dead of winter, these sounds warmed the soul faster than any fire. But tending animals wasn't just about feeding them. Peasants checked hooves for cracks, brushed frost from their coats, and made sure none had fallen ill during the night. A sick animal in winter was a heavy worry, one that weighed on a family's mind long after chores were done. Once the animals were fed and calm, peasants stepped back outside to face the rest of the morning. Frost glittered on their clothing. Their breath drifted away in pale puffs. The sky, pale and muted, promised another long day of cold. Yet, despite everything, there was a certain beauty to these moments, the quiet, the stillness, the unspoken partnership between people and the land they lived on. Winter demanded patience. It demanded presence. And tending the animals at dawn was a grounding ritual, reminding peasants of their place in the delicate balance of survival. With the animals cared for, it was time to face the next tasks: gathering fuel, managing water, repairing tools, each step drawing them deeper into the rhythm of another winter's day. After the animals were tended to and the first breath of the day had settled into a steady rhythm, peasants turned to another never-ending winter responsibility: gathering fuel to keep the hearth alive. Firewood wasn't just useful, it was as essential as food. Without it, nights became unbearable, and even daytime chores could become dangerous. But finding enough fuel in winter was rarely simple. Many families had spent autumn cutting, stacking, and drying wood, knowing that the coming months would devour their supply quickly. Still, no matter how carefully they prepared, winter always seemed to demand a little more. Logs vanished faster than anyone expected. Branches burned too quickly. What looked like a large pile in October often shrank to a worrying heap by January. Stepping into the cold to fetch more wood was its own small challenge. Snow made every footstep heavy, every movement slow. Frozen ground cracked beneath clogs, sending sharp sounds echoing through the still air. Reaching the woodpile often meant brushing off snow, shaking loose frost, and choosing pieces that would burn steadily rather than sputter out too soon. Some wood was stubborn, refusing to split easily. Peasants used simple axes or mallets, striking again and again until the log finally yielded. Each swing was a small burst of warmth in the freezing air. Steam rose gently from their breath and from the fresh wood itself, creating a faint dance of mist in the morning light. Not all families had large wood piles. Many relied on whatever the land offered, fallen branches, twigs, old fence posts, or even bundles of dry brush. Children often helped, their small hands gathering kindling from nearby trees or bushes. Even the smallest stick mattered. In winter, nothing was wasted. Some peasants burned peat if it was available, cutting thick bricks from bogs earlier in the year. Others resorted to dried dung patties, simple, practical, and surprisingly long burning. It wasn't elegant, but warmth was warmth, and survival didn't care much about elegance. Once enough wood and kindling were gathered, the bundle was carried back to the home. Cloaks grew dusted with snow and fingers tingled from the cold, but the promise of a stronger fire made every trip worthwhile. The moment they opened the door, a wave of smoky warmth greeted them, wrapping around their chilled faces like a gentle welcome back. Inside, the fire was fed carefully, each piece placed with intention. The flames brightened, crackling with renewed life. Sparks danced upward, flickering against the dim interior. The room seemed to breathe again, soft, glowing, alive. Gathering wood wasn't just a chore. It was part of the steady rhythm that kept winter at bay. Every log thrown into the hearth was a small victory, a reminder that warmth was still within reach. And as peasants stepped back on the fire, rubbing their hands together, they felt the quiet satisfaction of this simple, essential task. One more small triumph in the long battle against the cold. With the fire strengthened and the morning slowly unfolding, medieval peasants turned to another quiet but essential duty of winter: managing water. It was a task so ordinary in warmer months, yet in winter, it became a small battle fought every single day. Water didn't flow easily this time of year. Wells froze at the top, buckets turned solid overnight, and streams ran sluggish beneath thick sheets of ice. Something as simple as filling a pot required patience, strength, and a willingness to face the biting cold again and again. The family's water source dictated the morning's challenge. If they had a well, the first step was breaking through a frozen layer that sealed its opening. Peasants did this with wooden poles, stones, or even the blunt end of a tool, tapping until cracks formed. Each strike echoed softly through the chill air. Then came the lowering of the bucket, slowly, carefully, until it dipped into water that remained flowing deep beneath the ice. The rope stiffened in the cold, rough against gloved hands, but they pulled steadily, inch by inch, until the bucket emerged with a small cloud of steam rising from its surface. For those without a well, the task could be even harder. They walked to nearby streams or ponds, crunching through frost underfoot, carrying empty wooden buckets or clay jugs. Breaking ice at the water's edge was tiring but necessary, sending shards drifting away like pieces of broken glass. Children often help with this chore, bundled tightly and carrying smaller containers. Their breath puffed out like little clouds with every step. Even they understood the importance. Without water, cooking, washing, and caring for animals would come to a halt. The journey back home was slow, but steady. The weight of water pulled heavily on shoulders and arms, sloshing gently with each movement. In the cold, every drop mattered. Spilling water felt like losing something precious. Inside the home, the water was placed near the fire to keep it from freezing. Sometimes a pot stayed warm all day, ready for cooking or simple warmth. Other containers were tucked close to the hearth or wrapped in cloth to delay the inevitable freezing. Peasants planned carefully. They used water sparingly, saved what they could, and made multiple trips when needed. Every decision was practical. Wash only what must be washed. Cook in one pot. Melt snow if supplies ran low. Despite the hardship, there was a quiet rhythm to it. The sound of cracking ice, the steady pull of rope, the soft slosh of water in the bucket. These were part of winter's morning music, familiar and strangely comforting in their repetition. Managing water wasn't just a chore. It was another quiet promise they made to themselves. We will endure this day, just as we endured the last. And with that promise held close, the family continued on with their morning, step by step, keeping warmth and life flowing through even the coldest days. With water gathered and the fire thriving once more, the morning continued its slow, steady rhythm. Medieval peasants next turned their attention to the smaller, quieter tasks that held their home together. Those little moments of routine that didn't seem dramatic, but collectively shaped the heart of each winter day. Tools were often the first concern. Winter was hard on everything. Handles cracked from the cold, metal edges dulled faster, and wooden frames swelled or shrank depending on how the night had treated them. Before facing the day's work, peasants checked their tools with gentle, practiced hands. An axe was tested with a light swing. A wooden bucket was examined for leaks, its seams rubbed with a thumb to make sure the frost hadn't loosened them. Clay pots were inspected for any new cracks, especially the fine, hairline ones that appeared without warning after a long, cold night. Even ropes were checked, because winter had a way of stiffening fibers until they snapped under too much tension. These checks weren't rushed. Everything was done patiently, with a kind of quiet respect. Tools weren't just objects. They were companions in survival, extensions of the hands that used them. Caring for them was like tending to members of the household. Next came the home itself, though many repairs had already been made earlier in the morning. There were always more little tasks waiting. Loose straw on the floor was swept aside and replaced. The door latch might need tightening. A draft from the wall required another handful of moss or a new smear of mud. Sometimes a corner of the house felt colder than usual. In that case, someone would kneel and feel around gently, trying to find where the cold slipped through. These small rituals of care were done quietly, often with the soft crackling of the fire in the background and the distant sound of cows shifting in the nearby pen. Breakfast simmered during these early tasks. A pot of porridge thickened slowly over the hearth, sending warm, comforting aromas through the chilly air. On some days, a small piece of dried fruit or a sliver of leftover meat would be stirred in, a little luxury, a little sweetness to start the morning with something kind. As they worked, the family spoke in soft voices. If they spoke at all, Winter mornings didn't inspire loud conversations. They inspired stillness, calm, and gentle movement. The family simply existed together, moving from task to task with shared understanding of what needed to be done, without needing many words. By the time breakfast was ready, the home felt renewed. Tools were prepared, repairs made, water stored, fire blazing. Every little action, every small adjustment was a step toward ensuring they could make it through another day. And in that quiet, humble way, the morning shaped itself into something steady and reassuring. A reminder that even in winter's harshest days, a sense of order and care still held everything together. Once the home was tidied and the morning chores were well underway, medieval peasants gathered for breakfast, a simple, quiet moment that offered warmth not just to the body, but to the spirit. After a long night of cold and worry, this early meal felt like a small blessing, something steady they could rely on every single day. The food itself was modest. Most mornings began with a thick, warm porridge made from oats, barley, or whatever grain the family had managed to store through the year. It simmered softly in a clay pot over the fire, absorbing heat slowly until it thickened into something hearty and filling. The aroma spread gently through the home, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and giving everyone a sense of comfort. If the family was lucky, the porridge was brightened with a drizzle of honey, a pinch of dried herbs, or a few pieces of fruit saved from autumn. These additions felt like treasures, small but meaningful touches that made the morning feel less bleak. On rare days, a splash of milk or a spoonful of animal fat was stirred in, making the meal richer and more sustaining. The family gathered around the hearth to eat. Sitting close to the heat, bowls cradled warmly in their hands. Conversation was soft, almost whispered. No one wanted to disturb the peaceful stillness that settled in the room. The crackling fire, the gentle clink of wooden spoons against bowls, and the faint hum of wind outside were the only sounds. Children often ate first, encouraged by their parents to fill their bellies before facing the cold. Their cheeks, still pink from sleep, warmed even more as they lifted each spoonful of porridge, sighing contentedly as the heat spread through their bodies. Adults ate slower, savoring each bite while mentally planning the day's work. They knew the hours ahead would be long and demanding, so this quiet moment of warmth and nourishment was something they held close. Sometimes breakfast included small tasks as well. Someone might melt snow in a pot for washing. Someone else might carve slices from a loaf of coarse bread, sharing it around the group. Even in these simple gestures, there was a deep sense of routine and togetherness. The fire burned steadily as they ate, its glow brushing gently against their faces. Outside, the pale winter sun climbed higher, though it brought little warmth with it. Still, the sight of daylight through the cracks in the shuttered window signaled the day's true beginning. When the bowls were empty and their hands were warm, the family rose slowly, stretching their limbs and preparing to step back into the cold. Breakfast was short, but it gave them exactly what they needed: warmth, strength, and a quiet moment of unity. And as they moved toward the door, bundling their cloaks and tightening their scarves, they carried a memory of that small morning comfort with them, something soft to hold on to in the long, frosty hours ahead. After breakfast, when warmth still lingered in their chests and the fire's glow clung softly to their clothing, medieval peasants stepped fully into the day. Winter didn't pause for anyone, not for tired hands, not for aching backs. So the moment the morning meal ended, the real work began. The land outside was quiet, covered in layers of frost that sparkled under the pale sun. Even though fields slept during winter, there was never a shortage of tasks waiting. Survival depended on constant motion, constant effort, and even the smallest chores mattered. One of the first responsibilities was checking the food stores. Families made their way to storage huts, cellars, or carefully sealed clay jars tucked away in corners of the home. Supplies had to be monitored closely. Winter had a habit of stretching itself longer than anyone hoped. Grain sacks were squeezed to judge how much was left. Root vegetables were inspected, sorted, and sometimes trimmed if they showed signs of softening. Drying herbs hung silently overhead, their faded leaves carrying the last whispers of warmer seasons. Each item had to last, each piece handled with care. Waste was not an option, not when every morsel was a shield against hunger. After the food stores were checked, attention turned to tasks outdoors. Even in the coldest months, fences still needed mending, pathways needed clearing, and animals needed fresh bedding. The frozen ground made everything slower, but peasants accepted this with quiet determination. Some gathered armfuls of straw, spreading it in stables to keep animals comfortable. Others carried tools to mend broken planks or tighten loose posts. Every repair, no matter how small, helped guard against winter's persistent attempts to slip into their lives. Children often helped by collecting fallen branches or breaking ice from small troughs. Their laughter, though quiet in the cold air, brought a bit of brightness to morning. Even winter couldn't silence a child's curiosity. Now and then, someone ventured farther out to check the edge of the forest or gather additional supplies. These quiet walks through frozen fields carried a peaceful rhythm. Footsteps crunched softly, breath drifted like tiny clouds, and the world felt hushed, as if winter itself listened to every movement. Inside the home, someone tended the fire, adding wood now and then to keep the warmth alive. The house remained the anchor, a place of return to when hands grew too cold or the wind began to bite harder. Winter days were long, but they followed a familiar pattern. Each small task flowed into the next, creating a steady rhythm that helped peasants stay focused, stay hopeful, and stay connected to the world around them. Even when the cold pressed hard against their skin, they moved through the day with quiet strength, holding tight to the belief that every repaired fence, every chopped piece of wood, every preserved root brought them one step closer to spring. As the day continued, another essential winter task came to the forefront, protecting what little food and resources the family had left. Hunger didn't just come from empty cupboards. It came from unwelcome visitors who also struggled to survive the harsh cold outside. Winter brought all kinds of creatures seeking warmth and easy meals. Mice, birds, small animals. Sometimes even bold foxes sniffing around the edges of homes and barns. For medieval peasants, guarding their supplies wasn't simply a chore. It was a constant, quiet vigilance. Inside the home, they checked wooden chests, clay pots, and woven baskets to make sure no tiny nibbling intruder had made its way in. A small hole chewed to the side of a grain sack could mean days of lost food, so every container was inspected closely. If signs of pests were found, scatter husks or little footprints in the dust. The family quickly sealed cracks and moved stores higher or closer to hearth. Cats were treasure helpers in this battle. Even the shyest, most aloof cat became a guardian in winter, patrolling dark corners with slow, sure steps. Children watched them proudly, offering scraps of food as a thank you for their quiet service. Outside, the vigilance continued. Barns and sheds were checked for loose boards or gaps that might invite animals looking for shelter. Haystacks were tied tighter. Doors were secured firmly. The cold could drive even gentle creatures into chaos, and peasants understood the importance of being one step ahead. Sometimes, small traps were placed around the edges of property. Simple loops of rope, wooden mechanisms, or carefully set pits. Not out of cruelty, but necessity. Winter tested every being, and peasants could not afford to lose what kept their families alive. Still, there was a kind of calm woven into this watchfulness. Moving quietly through the home, listening to the soft rustle of stored grain or the faint creak of wooden beams, peasants developed a deep awareness of their surroundings. They could tell when something fell off, when a draft changed direction, when a rustling sound wasn't quite right, when the animals shifted with unease. In the stillness of winter days, this careful attention became a silent partner in survival. Once everything was checked and secured, the family returned to their other tasks with a bit more ease. They knew their supplies were safe, their home guarded, their animals sheltered. These simple acts of protection, gentle, intentional, and steady, were small victories that helped carry them through the toughest months. Winter might test their limits, but peasants met the challenge with resilience and quiet wisdom. One secure door, one sealed crack, one vigilant moment at a time. As midday approached, the sun hung low in the sky, offering light but very little warmth. Even so, winter days carried their own quiet rhythm, and medieval peasants used these hours to take on tasks that required daylight. The morning's urgency gave way to a slower, steadier energy, one shaped by cold air, careful movements, and the knowledge that daylight was precious. One of the most important midday tasks was maintaining tools and equipment. Even if they weren't used as frequently during winter, tools still needed to be kept in good condition for the months ahead. A neglected blade could mean trouble come spring, and peasants knew that a little care each day helped prevent bigger problems later. They brought tools near the fire where the wood was softer, easier to work with. Handles were tightened, cracks were bound with strips of cloth, and blades were sharpened with patient, rhythmic strokes. The sound of metal scraping stone echoed softly through the house, steady, familiar, almost soothing. During these hours, families often worked together. Someone prepared cords for future repairs, twisting fibers by hand until they formed sturdy ropes. Someone else sorted through baskets of old nails, bent pieces of metal, and scraps that might be useful later. Nothing was wasted. Everything had potential. Outside, chores continued too. Snow and ice made every task slower, but some jobs couldn't wait. A fence leaning too far needed straightening before animals wandered too close. A hinge that froze overnight needed to be loosened. Paths leading to the well or barn had to be cleared, even if the wind filled them again soon after. Children helped in their own small ways, carrying light bundles, gathering twigs, or sweeping thin layers of snow from doorways. Their presence brought life to the frozen world. Their small footprints marked trails across the yard, and their giggles rose like warm pockets of sound in the cold air. Inside the home, someone always kept watch over the hearth. Flames danced steadily, glowing brighter whenever a new log was added. It wasn't just warmth, it was security. A fire that stayed strong through midday meant less frantic work by nightfall. Sometimes, midday brought a brief pause. A moment to sit, breathe, and warm cold hands over flames. A moment to sip warm broth or nibble a slice of bread saved from breakfast. These pauses weren't breaks so much as necessary breaths in the long rhythm of the day. Through it all, a quiet determination filled the air. Winter demanded patience, and peasants met that demand with calm persistence. Every mended tool, every cleared path, every careful motion carried them another step forward. As shadows stretched across the frosty ground, the family continued their work with steady hearts, knowing that each task completed during these precious hours made the coming night just a little easier to face. As the afternoon unfolded, the lights softened and the cold deepened, wrapping the village in a quiet stillness. These hours between noon and dusk were some of the most delicate of the day, a fragile window when peasants prepared themselves in their homes for the long, unforgiving night ahead. One of the most important tasks during this time was gathering whatever remaining daylight they had to check the perimeter of their property. Winter had a habit of shifting things silently. Snow drifts grew taller, branches bent lower, and wooden beams strained under the accumulating weight of ice. What seemed safe in the morning might require attention by afternoon. Peasants walked slowly around their homes, cloaks wrapped tightly, footsteps crunching softly beneath the snow. They examined the walls for new cracks, fell along the roof line for sagging spots, and brushed snow away from places where it threatened to pile too high. Even small patches of ice were cleared from pathways to prevent dangerous slips in the dark. Sometimes they discovered wind-blown damage, thatch stripped loose, shutters rattling against their frames, or bits of straw and debris caught in corners where drafts gathered strength. These small troubles were fixed immediately, while the light still offered its fading guidance. Meanwhile, others tended to the animals once more. As daylight shortened, feed needed to be doubled and water checked carefully. The animals' warmth was precious, and making sure they were settled before nightfall was an act of both practicality and quiet affection. Fresh straw was spread generously, forming thick, soft bedding that would hold warmth through the long hours ahead. Inside the home, preparations continued with gentle determination. More was brought to the hearth, so the fire could burn without interruption. Pots of stew or porridge were stirred slowly, allowing flavors to deepen and warmth to soak into the air. The scent filled the home, rich, comforting, promising nourishment at the end of the day. Clothing was inspected once more. Damp cloaks were laid near the fire to dry. Woolen mittens stiffened by frost were softened with gentle heat. Scarves were checked for tears. Every layer mattered, especially when darkness brought its sharpest cold. Children often spent this time indoors, helping with simple chores, sorting kindling, sweeping straw from corners, or folding extra cloths to bring to bed later. Their chatter, soft and warm, filled the room like little sparks of joy against winter's chill. As shadows lengthened, the family moved more softly, more slowly. These hours carried a kind of thoughtful calm, an unspoken understanding that night required preparation, patience, and respect. When the sun finally began its descent, painting the sky with pale gold and blue, everything was ready. Animals fed, walls secured, with stacked meals simmering and hearts quietly steady. Winter's night would soon return, vast and cold, but the family, wrapped in the comfort of their careful preparation, would be ready to meet it once more. As daylight thinned and the world outside began slipping toward evening, medieval peasants shifted gently into the next quiet rhythm of winter, the slow, thoughtful preparations for night. This transition wasn't rushed. It unfolded gradually, like watching the colors fade from the sky. Inside the home, the hearth became the true center of attention once again. Its glow deepened as fresh wood was added, sending small sparks swirling upward. The fire's crackle grew louder in the stillness, a steady promise that warmth would hold through the creeping cold. This was the hour when families gathered closely, moving around the home with deliberate care. Every task had purpose. Every action carried weight. Clothing was brought closer to the fire to warm before the night chill settled in. Woolen cloaks, thick shawls, patched tunics, and rough socks hung from wooden pegs, absorbing heat slowly. Even boots were placed near the hearth, not close enough to scorch, but near enough to soften the stiff cold inside them. The evening meal simmered gently in a large pot. Whatever the family had, root vegetables, grains, a small piece of salted meat, combined into a fragrant stew. The warmth of the food soaked into the air, easing the day's chill from their bones. Each bubble from the pot felt like a quiet blessing, a reminder that comfort could be found even in the hardest of seasons. Water was warmed as well, filling wooden bowls that served many purposes. Washing hands and faces, cleaning tools, or simply offering a bit of warmth to tired fingers. Children especially loved dipping their hands into steam, watching it curl up into the dimming air like a tiny magical cloud. As preparations continued, the firelight painted the walls with trembling shadows. The flickering glow made the room feel alive, soft, golden, and safe. Outside, the world darkened quickly, but inside, the home stood bright and secure. Someone checked the door one last time, pressing it firmly against the frame to block the cold. Another made sure the windows' coverings were tightly secured. The house seemed to breathe with the family, settling into its nighttime shape. A few moments of quiet reflection often filled this time. Perhaps a story was whispered, or a simple prayer offered, or memory shared from long ago. These gentle exchanges brought a kind of warmth that even fire couldn't match, emotional, steady, and deeply human. Children grew sleepier as the room filled with the soft hum of evening. They curled closer to one another, their eyes heavy, comforted by the familiar sounds of routine. By the time darkness fully embraced the world outside, the home was ready. The fire burned strong. The meal was nearly done. The family moved with a sense of calm assurance, knowing they had done everything possible to prepare. Night was coming, but they were prepared to meet together, wrapped in warmth, patience, and quiet resilience. As evening finally settled over the village, the world outside disappeared into a blanket of deep winter darkness. Shadows stretched long at first, then melted fully into the night, leaving only the faintest glow of moonlight reflecting off the snow. Indoors, however, a quiet warmth blossomed, the kind that made even the coldest night feel a little less daunting. This was the hour when families shared their evening meal, gathering close around the hearth where the stew had been simmering all afternoon. Bowls were filled with careful hands. The food was simple and humble, yet in winter, even the smallest warm meal felt like a feast. The first spoonful brought immediate comfort, traveling through tired bodies like a gentle spark of life. Steam drifted upward in soft curls, and the scent of herbs, vegetables, and wood smoke blended into a cozy symphony. Children leaned close to their bowls, their cheeks flushed and eyes drooping with the slow pull of sleep. Conversation during these meals was quiet, almost hushed. Voices stayed low so as not to disturb the tranquility that had settled over the home. Adults spoke of chores completed, the weather outside, or small tasks that needed tending in mourning. Sometimes a story from long ago was shared, tales of ancestors, distant places, or lessons carried through generations. These stories weren't told with excitement or flourish. They were delivered like soft lullabies, guiding the mind gently toward rest. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to listen, chiming in with tiny pops as if encouraging the storyteller along. After the meal, bowls were rinsed with warm water and set aside. The last scraps were saved carefully, nothing wasted, everything valued. A pot was left near the hearth to keep water warm through the early night, ready for whatever use might come. As the firelight flickered across the walls, it painted gentle patterns in the shadows. The room felt small in the best way, cozy and closed, like a nest tucked safely against the chill outside. The soft rustling of blankets, the steady breathing of livestock just beyond the wall, and the subtle whistle of wind against the thatched roof created a quiet lull of winter evening music. Parents helped younger children prepare for bed, wrapping them in layers of wool and tucking them onto the shared straw mattress. Older family members joined soon after, shrugging deeper into their blankets, letting their tired bodies sink into warmth they had worked so hard to preserve all day. Before fully settling in, someone always checked the fire. The embers glowed a deep, comforting red, and the flames danced softly. Wood was added carefully, ensuring the fire would last long into the night. It was not just a flame. It was life itself, glowing bravely against the vast winter darkness. With everything in place, food eaten, home secured, fire tended, the family allowed themselves a rest. The world outside was silent and cold, but inside, a serene peace filled the room. Night wrapped around them gently, and they drifted towards sleep, carried by the warmth of the hearth, the closeness of family, and the quiet triumph of having made it through another winter day. As the night deepened and the last traces of daylight faded completely, medieval peasants settled into the slow, quiet moments before sleep. These hours, soft, dim, and filled with gentle routine, were some of the most peaceful of the day. Winter may have been harsh, but evenings carried a certain tenderness, a fragile calm that wrapped itself around the household like a warm cloak. Before anyone fully drifted off, there were still small, important tasks to tend to. The fire, for instance, required careful watching. Keeping it alive through the night was essential. Someone would kneel beside the hearth, stirring the embers with practiced patience, making sure the flames were neither too lively nor too faint. Wood was placed with quiet precision, building a slow-burning bed of coals meant to last for hours. Next came the task of banking the fire, gently covering the glowing embers with ash. This simple act trapped heat, letting warmth linger deep within the hearth even after the visible flames dimmed. It was like tucking the fire in for the night, giving it a blanket to sleep under. Done properly, it ensured that by morning, a soft glow remained, ready to rise again without the struggle of building a fire from scratch. Around the room, blankets and spare cloths were pulled into place. Straw bedding was fluffed as best as possible, though it was always a bit uneven, always a bit scratchy. Still, it held warm surprisingly well, especially once everyone settled close together. Children nestled into the middle, where the heat was strongest. Adults surrounded them, creating a living barrier against the cold. The arrangement was instinctive, shaped by countless winters and a deep understanding of how to pass through the night safely. Voices grew softer as the family whispered a few final words. Small reminders, quiet jokes, or soothing reassurances spoken in the dim light. Sometimes a prayer was offered, not dramatic or elaborate, just a simple wish for protection through the night, for safety, for warmth. The room dimmed further as the fire simmered down. Shadows stretched gently across the walls, flickering with the last dance of flames. The familiar scent of smoke, wool, and cooling stew settled into a comforting stillness. Outside, the wind brushed against the house with long, low sighs, as though night itself was breathing. Snow creaked softly under the shifting weight of the cold. The world felt distant and vast. But inside the small hut, everything was close and safe. Breath slowed. Movements softened. The room filled with a subtle symphony of nighttime. Soft snoring, the rustle of blanket, the quiet shifting of animals nearby, wrapped together in warmth, in shared breath and shared hope. The family slowly slipped into sleep. They surrendered to the darkness not with fear, but with the gentle confidence of people who prepared well, who trusted the fire, who trusted one another. Night held them tenderly, and in that fragile peace, they found rest. As the household settled deeper into sleep, the night outside grew colder, stretching long and still across the land. Winter nights were never gentle, not truly, but in these quiet hours, wrapped in darkness, there was a strange sense of pause. Time seemed to slow, as if the entire world were holding its breath. Yet sleep for medieval peasants was rarely continuous. The cold had a way of nudging people awake, sometimes subtly, sometimes sharply. A creeping draft slipping through a small opening in the wall, the shift of a restless animal, the soft sputter of a fire growing weak. These small disturbances stirred the family at intervals throughout the night. Often, one person, usually an older child or an adult accustomed to broken sleep, would wake first. They'd open their eyes to the dim glow of embers glowing like tiny red stars in the hearth. The room felt colder now, the air biting more sharply at fingertips and cheeks. Cloaks rustled softly as they adjusted their blankets, careful not to wake the others. If the fire seemed too faint, they would rise quietly, moving slowly across the room. Kneeling before the hearth, they'd lift the ash layer slightly, letting the embers breathe. A small piece of wood or a handful of kindling might be added, just enough to coax a steady warmth without creating bright flames that consumed wood too quickly. The goal was simple: keep the cold at bay while preserving precious fuel. Once the fire was secure again, they returned to their place among the sleeping family, tucking themselves back into the shared warmth. The brief disturbance often made others shift slightly, a small sigh, a sleepy murmur. But soon the soft rhythm of rest filled the room again. Outside, the winter night moved onward. Frost crept across rooftops, weaving delicate patterns on frozen thatch. Trees groaned softly under the weight of ice. Far off in the distance, the faint cry of an animal echoed through the darkness, quickly swallowed by wind. The world seemed vast, empty, and silent, as though it were dreaming too. Inside, though, the hut remained a small island of warmth. Every breath of family took form faint clouds that drifted upward and vanished. Every shared blanket, every woolen layer, every carefully placed ember worked together to protect them through the long hours. Now and then, someone's hand reached instinctively for another's, seeking warmth, seeking reassurance. These small touches, unconscious and gentle, bound the family together more tightly than any wall or door ever could. As the night stretched on, the fire smoldered steadily, glowing brighter whenever a crackle would shift it within it. The warm circle of its light held back the cold just enough, wrapping the family in a soft cocoon of safety and rest. And so, hour by hour, breath by breath, warmth by fragile warmth, the family drifted to the darkness, held by the fire they tended, by the closeness they shared, and by the quiet strength that carried them through every winter night. As the night continued its slow and silent passage, there came a moment when the deepest darkness began to shift, so subtly that no one awake could have noticed. It was a quiet turning of the earth toward dawn, a gentle promise that the long winter night would not last forever. Inside the hut, the family remained bundled together, breathing softly in the dim glow of the resting hearth. But nature had its own ways of nudging the world toward morning. The fire, though now reduced to quiet embers, still pulsed every so often with a faint, warm shimmer. Outside, the wind softened, losing some of its sharp bite as the sky slowly, invisibly prepared for a new day. This was often the coldest hour of the night, the moment just before dawn, when even the thickest blankets felt thin and the air seemed to cling to the skin like frost. It was at this time that someone usually stirred again, pulled from sleep by instinct rather than noise. Centuries of winter living had taught families that the final stretch of the night required care, especially if they wanted the morning to meet them with warmth. Eyes opened reluctantly, adjusting to the faintest red glow coming from a hearth. The sleeper shifted quietly, careful not to disturb those nestled around them. The air felt sharper now, pressing against cheeks and fingertips. They rose slowly, sliding from beneath the shared blankets and letting the cold nip at their legs. Their breath formed little clouds in the darkness as they crossed the room, the floorboards cool beneath their feet. Kneeling before the hearth, they gently brushed aside the thin layer of ash that covered the embers, waking them with a few soft strokes. A faint orange glow brightened, stretching outward like a yawn. A small stick was placed atop the embers, then another, coaxing the fire back to life. Crackles whispered into silence, tiny sparks dancing upward, greeting the first hint of dawn. The warmth grew, slow but steady, spreading through the room in invisible waves. The shift was almost magical, the way a single ember, when tended with patience, could begin to chase away the cold that had gathered in the long night hours. With the fire steady again, the watcher lingered for a moment, holding their hands out toward the glow. The warmth soothed their chilled skin, bringing back feeling to their fingertips. In this quiet hush, surrounded by sleeping family and the faint hope of morning, they allowed themselves a rare moment of stillness. Outside, the darkness began its gentle retreat. The sky, though still deep and blue, held a subtle change, a thinning, a softening. Frost glistened faintly along the windowsill, catching the earliest whispers of returning light. The household continued to sleep, wrapped in warmth and safety. But the night was loosening its grip. Winter's hardest hours were nearly past, and within that small, humble hut, the glowing fire marked a transition from one day to the next, silent, steadfast, and full of quiet promise. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world outside began to lighten. Dawn in winter did not arrive with bold colors or sudden brightness. It crept in softly, like a shy visitor easing open a door. A faint gray glow touched the horizon, spreading gently across the frosted fields and quiet rooftops. Inside the small hut, the renewed fire cast a warm shimmer across the room. The gentle crackling of wood rose and fell like a heartbeat, steady and reassuring. The warmth drifted outward, reaching the far corners of the space and nudging the cold into retreat. The air still held a crisp bite, but the growing fire softened its edge. These early moments of morning were delicate. No one woke suddenly. Instead, waking came in slow waves. One person shifted under the blankets. Another sighed sleepily. A child curled closer to a warm shoulder. The shared breath of the family filled the room in soft clouds, fading quickly into the rising warmth. Gradually, eyelids fluttered open. The first awake blinked at the faint morning light, slipping in through cracks and shutters. The shapes inside the room became clearer. The stacked firewood by the wall, the simmering pot left near the hearth overnight, the woven baskets holding precious food stores. There was no rush. Winter mornings rarely brought urgency. Instead, waking felt like a gentle unfolding, guided by warmth, dim light, and the soft murmurs of others stirring. Someone stretched their arms slowly, shaking off the last threads of sleep. Another rubbed their eyes with the back of their hands. Hair tousled from the night. Children peeked over blankets, still wrapped in wool, their cheeks rosy from shared warmth. Soon, soft voices began to fill the space. Low whispers, gentle greetings, the kind of quiet sounds that ease a family fully into the new day. The fire's glow strengthened steadily. Flames curled upward, brightening the room with their golden dance. The light painted warm patches on the floor and flickered across the wooden walls, creating moving patterns that felt almost alive. Outside, a thin layer of frost clung to the window edges, shining like tiny crystals in the dim light. The world beyond the hut remained cold and silent, but the promise of daybreak softened its harshness. Someone rose from the bedding, pulling a woolen cloak around their shoulders. Their movements were slow but practiced as they stepped to the hearth, checking the fire with calm, experienced hands. A log was added, and sparks rose gracefully, filling the room with a fresh wave of heat. The scent of warm wood smoke blended with the faint aroma of last night's stew. It was a comforting combination. The smell of safety, of home, of another day successfully reached. As the fire grew and morning settled more firmly over the village, the family began shaking off the night's cold, preparing to rise and return to the rhythm of winter. But for this brief, tender moment, they simply sat close to one another, soaking in the warmth and quiet peace that only dawn in the deepest winter could bring. With dawn now gently settling over the land, the family began to rise from their bedding in slow, careful motions. Winter mornings required patience. Limbs stiffened from the cold, took time to warm, and no one wanted to leave the soft cocoon of shared blankets too quickly. Yet the day called to them, urging them back into their steady rhythm of survival. The first footsteps on the floorboards were soft and measured. A parent or older sibling made their way toward the hearth, stretching out their hands toward the flames. The warmth seeped into their skin, chasing away the lingering chill of the night. Soon, others followed, gathering close to the fire, letting its glow embrace them like an old friend. Gradually, the room filled with quiet movement. Blankets were folded neatly and placed aside, straw bedding gently shaken out to remove the chill. Cloaks were pulled around shoulders, and woolen socks adjusted to sit comfortably against cold feet. Each gesture held the same calm intention. Prepare for the day with care, with steadiness, with respect for the winter beyond the door. One person approached the pot that had been left near the hearth overnight. Its contents, warmed slightly by the fire's steady heat, were stirred with slow, thoughtful motions. The simple stew from the night before it thickened as it rested, becoming even heartier, a small blessing for the morning meal. Soon, wooden bowls were brought out, each worn smooth by years of use. Steam curled upward as the warm food was ladled into them. Breakfast was humble. but it offered strength, and strength was a quiet foundation of every winter day. The family gathered once more around the hearth to eat. They sat close, letting the fire warm their cheeks as they held their bowls between chill fingers. Their breaths formed small white clouds that drifted upward and vanished. The gentle sound of slow eating, spoons brushing against bowls, soft murmurs, the occasional sigh of contentment, filled the room with a peaceful intimacy. Children leaned sleepily against their parents, still waking, their eyes half open as they took small bites. Older members of the household ate with steady focus, already thinking ahead to the tasks that awaited them outside. The cold might slow them, but it could not stop them. Once the bowls were emptied, they were rinsed with warm water from a clay jug warmed by the fire. Each person took a moment to stretch, to breathe deeply, to gather the mental strength needed for another winter day. Coats were fastened, scarves were wrapped tightly, hoods were pulled low, hands were rubbed together to spark warmth before meeting the icy air outside. The first person reached for the wooden door and paused, as everyone did each morning, to listen to the world beyond it. The muffled quiet of snow greeted them. No wind howled, no storm brewed. It was a moment of stillness, a small gift from winter. With a slow push, the door creaked open, letting in the crisp breath of the morning. Frost shimmered across the ground, sparkling faintly beneath the pale light of early day. The village lay silent, peaceful, as though still waking from its own slumber. Together, the family stepped into the new day, carrying the warmth of the hearth within them, a gentle fire in their hearts that would guide them to the cold hours ahead. Stepping into morning, medieval peasants greeted the new day with quiet determination. The world outside was still wrapped in winter's heavy silence, but now softened by the early light that washed gently over the frosted earth. Everything sparkled faintly: rooftops, fence posts, even the bare branches of trees, each touched by a delicate layer of ice that glowed under the pale sky. The first breath of cold morning air was always sharp. It stung the lungs, tingled against the skin, and pushed sleep fully from their minds. But it also awakened a certain clarity, a silent reminder of the work that lay ahead. Winter did not allow for slowness, not beyond these first few steps. So after a brief moment of stillness, the family spread out to begin their daily duties. One of the earliest tasks was to check on the animals again. The barns and small shelters stood quiet, warmed only by the breath and bodies of the creatures inside. As the door opened, a soft wave of warm air met the cold morning, carrying with the earthy scent of hay and livestock. Animals lifted their heads, blinking against the sudden brightness. Fresh hay was offered, scattered gently to replace what had been slept on. Any buckets of water that had frozen during the night were emptied and refilled with new, warmed water carried carefully from a hearth. The animals responded with soft grunts, rustles, and gentle snorts, small expressions of comfort and gratitude in the cold. Outside, paths needed attention. Snow had shifted overnight, settling in uneven layers. Footprints from the previous day were partly erased, blurred into faint impressions. Peasants took up simple tools, shovels fashioned from wood, bundles of straw used as makeshift brooms, and began clearing the walkways once more. This was not just for convenience, but for safety. A clear path meant fewer slips, fewer injuries, fewer dangers hidden beneath the snow's gentle surface. Nearby, the well stood as another priority. Its stones were rimmed with frost, and the ropes stiff from the cold. Careful hands worked to break any thin layer of ice near the top, ensuring the water remained accessible. Buckets were lowered slowly, their surfaces brushing against the frozen edges. When the bucket rose full, water sloshed softly, sending ripples of reflected light dancing across the interior of the well. Some family members checked the fences and the edges of their land. Winter winds were notorious for loosening posts and shifting fallen branches. Even the smallest damage could grow worse if left unaddressed. They moved with deliberate attention, listening to the quiet groans of frozen wood, tightening what needed securing. These early tasks unfolded almost like a ritual, simple, necessary, repeated each day with the same care. The cold bit their fingertips, and their breath drifted in front of them in pale clouds, but they continued with steady hearts. Winter demanded resilience, and peasants met that demand through patience and thoughtful hands. As the sun climbed a little higher, the world brightened just enough to soften the harshness of the morning. Light slowly stretched across the fields, touching each patch of frost with a gentle glow. And with each task completed, the family inched closer, settling into the rhythm of another winter day, one filled with work, warmth, and the quiet strength that carried them to the season's long embrace. With the essential morning chores completed, medieval peasants eased into the next stretch of the day, a period shaped by both necessity and rhythm. The cold remained firm, clinging to everything it touched, but the rising light brought a quiet encouragement. It reminded them that even in the harshest season, time continued to move, and so must they. Inside the home, someone tended the hearth once more, adding just enough wood to keep the warmth steady without wasting precious fuel. The flames rose gently, casting a soft glow across the room. This warmth created a small sanctuary where hands thawed, cheeks softened, and the fatigue of the early morning began to fade. Small tasks unfolded naturally around this warm center. Woolen garments were inspected for wear, tiny tears sewn with practiced fingers, frayed edges reinforced with thread spun from stored fibers. These repairs were simple but vital. A well-mended cloak or mitten could mean the difference between comfort and pain in the cold hours ahead. Elsewhere in the home, dried herbs hung from beams above, emitting faint, soothing scents. Some were crumbled carefully into small clay bowls to flavor stews or teas. Others were ground into powders to add a hint of warmth or to help with winter discomforts, aches, chills, or restless sleep. The soft grinding sounds blended with the crackling of the fire, creating a gentle harmony within the quiet room. Children, still waking fully, helped with lighter tasks. They fetched small pieces of kindling, arranged baskets of stored vegetables, and sorted through bundles of cloth. Their movements were slow, unhurried, guided by the calm of the morning. Even their chatter, soft and subdued, matched the peaceful tone of the day. Outside, adults checked on food stores once more. Wooden chests were lifted open, lids creaking softly. Root vegetables were inspected for firmness, grains measured with thoughtful hands. Dried fruits counted and redistributed to ensure even use. Winter required careful planning. Every portion mattered, and every decision was made with the future in mind. In some homes, tools laid aside during the deepest cold were brought indoors to warm slightly before being repaired. Handles were tightened, metal cleaned, and edges sharpened with careful precision. These quiet maintenance tasks ensured that when the weather softened, even just a little, the family would be ready to take advantage of the moment. As midday approached, The winter sun cast a pale glow through small windows, illuminating the room with a faint but comforting light. Dust motes drifted through the air like tiny, shimmering flakes, dancing in the warmth of the hearth. Within the serene moment, peasants found a brief sense of balance. The hardest chores of the morning were behind them, and the pressing demands of evening had not yet begun. They stood in a kind of peaceful middle ground, a place where they could breathe, reflect, and prepare for the hours ahead. Winter was demanding, but these quiet interludes offered strength. And so, with calm hearts and steady hands, the family continued their day, carrying forward the warmth they had created together, one thoughtful task at a time. As the day moved gently past its midpoint, the winter sun hovered low in the sky, casting long, soft shadows across the land. Though daylight was scarce, these afternoon hours held their own quiet purpose. Moments when medieval peasants turned their attention to tasks that could only be done with whatever light remained. Inside the home, the hearth continued to glow steadily, its warmth a constant companion. The fire softened the cold that pressed against the walls, creating a small circle of comfort where hands could thaw and spirits could settle. Around this warm center, members of the household spread out to work on tasks that required careful hands and focused minds. One person might sort through stored grains, using a slow, practiced motion to sift out bits of chaff or debris. The soft sound of grain moving through fingers was almost soothing, a gentle reminder of harvest long past and the hope that another would come. Small imperfections were removed, and the remaining kernels stored neatly to last as long as possible. Nearby, another worked with simple tools, repairing wooden utensils or small household items. A cracked spoon might be sanded smooth, its edges reshaped with patient strokes. A loose peg could be tightened or replaced. These small repairs, insignificant on their own, were essential to keeping daily life running smoothly throughout the long winter months. Children often helped by organizing supplies. They gathered dried kindling into neat bundles, sorted cloth scraps by size and usefulness, or lined up jars to preserve herbs along a shelf. Their small hands moved with care, guided gently by the older members of the family. Each task taught them responsibility, patience, and the quiet rhythm of winter days. If the weather allowed, some family members stepped outside. They walked slowly across the crisp ground, boots crunching softly in the snow. Their breath rose in pale clouds as they checked the edges of the property once more. Fallen branches were collected for firewood. Snow brushed off tools that had been left in sheltered corners, and any drifted snow was cleared from paths. The air outside was sharp but stunningly still, a kind of winter silence that felt almost sacred. In the distance, smoke curled from neighboring homes, thin and pale against the sky. Occasionally, a bird's call echoed softly, breaking the stillness for just a moment before the world settled again. Back inside, someone warmed water over the fire to prepare it for washing wool or cleaning tools. The steam drifted upward lazily, carrying a warm scent that contrasted beautifully with the cold outside. These simple tasks, gentle rinses, careful scrubbing, soft drying near the fire, filled the room with a sense of disciplined calm. As the afternoon light softened further, drifting toward the color of early evening, a sense of quiet accomplishment settled over the home. The tasks completed were small but meaningful, steps toward ensuring that the family remained steady in winter's long embrace. Nothing was hurried, nothing was wasted, and in this slow, thoughtful work, the family found the comfort and strength needed to face the cold hours still ahead. As the light continued to fade and the cold pressed more firmly against the walls, medieval peasants turned their attention to one of the most important parts of winter survival: preparing the evening meal. It wasn't just about eating. It was about gathering warmth, comfort, and a moment of calm before the long night settled in. Inside the dimly lit home, the hearth fire crackled gently, its glow spreading across the room like a soft blanket. Someone added a few small pieces of wood, not too many, just enough to keep the flame steady without burning through precious fuel too quickly. The fire was the heart of the home, and evening was when it truly became the center of everything. A large pot was placed carefully over the embers. Into it went whatever ingredients the family had saved for dinner. Sometimes it was a thick vegetable stew made from turnips, onions, or carrots that had survived in storage. Other times it was a simple porridge, stirred slowly until it thickened. If they were fortunate, a scrap of salted meat or a handful of beans was added to make the meal richer. The scent of the cooking food eventually drifted through the room, earthy, warm, and familiar. It wasn't luxurious, but it was nourishing, and that was what mattered most. As the pot bubbled quietly, the family gathered close, watching the firelight ripple across the walls. Bread, if they had any, was placed near the fire to soften or warm. Hard rye loaves became easy to chew when heated, and even a little warmth made the simplest food feel more comforting on a cold evening. Children helped by setting out wooden bowls, each worn smooth from years of use, their surfaces marked by countless meals before. Conversation during this time was soft and unhurried. People spoke quietly about the tasks of the day, the weather outside, or the small hopes they carried for the days to come. These evening moments were gentle, almost sacred, a small pause in a life filled with relentless labor and winter's challenges. Once the meal was ready, the family ate slowly, savoring every spoonful. The warm food spread heat from the inside out, offering a sense of safety that only a full stomach could provide in such frigid months. Eating together strengthened both body and spirit, reminding each person that they were not facing the bitter season alone. When everyone finished, the pot was carefully cleaned with warm water from the hearth. Even this simple task brought a sense of closure to the day's work. Bowls were wiped dry, utensils put away, and the remaining fire tended with practiced care. Outside, the sky had already darkened to deep blue, the first stars shimmering faintly. The world grew quieter, the cold settling deeper into the land. But inside the home, the last of the evening warmth held strong. Soon, the family would prepare for sleep, but for now, the warm glow of the hearth and the gentle togetherness of the evening meal created a rare, peaceful stillness. In these calm moments, they found the strength to face the long night ahead. As night settled over the village and the last traces of daylight vanished, medieval peasants shifted their focus to securing their homes for the long, cold hours ahead. This was a daily ritual, simple, repetitive, but absolutely essential for surviving winter's unforgiving grip. The first task was always the door. Most peasant homes didn't have a proper lock or a heavy latch. Instead, they relied on a sturdy wooden bar or a thick beam that could be lowered into place. Someone would lift the bar carefully and set it across the doorpost, creating a solid barrier against the icy wind and anything else that might wander close in the dark. Once the door was secured, attention turned to the tiny window openings. These weren't glass panes, but animal hides or rough cloth stretched across wooden frames. Throughout the day, they might be lifted to let in air or faint sunlight. But once night arrived, they were checked thoroughly. Each hide was tightened, each cloth pulled snug to keep the cold from slipping inside through the smallest gap. Next came the inspection of the walls. Even though the house was modest, built from wood, mud, and straw, it required constant attention. Someone would walk slowly around the room, running their hand along the wall's uneven surface to feel for new drafts. When they found one, they stuffed the gap quickly with moss, straw, or cloth. These makeshift patches weren't beautiful, but they were effective, and each one helped preserve a little more warmth. Meanwhile, the fire continued to burn softly in the hearth. It needed to be tended with care as the night deepened. Too much fuel would waste precious wood. Too little would let the fire die out, leaving the family vulnerable to the cold. A few glowing embers were arranged neatly, and a couple of small logs were added, just enough to keep the flame steady without burning too fast. Animals inside the home were also settled for the night. Chickens rustled as they tucked themselves into corners. A goat might nuzzle into a bed of straw, chewing lazily as it grew warmer. Even the cows shifted closer to the fire's faint glow, their bodies radiating a gentle heat that made the room feel more alive. Children, often sleepy from the day's work, helped in small ways, passing bundles of straw, holding the door while the bar was set in place, or checking for tiny gaps near the floor where cold air might creep in. Their quiet involvement added a sense of closeness to the routine. Finally, once the home was sealed, the fire banked, and the animals quiet, a peaceful hush settled over the room. The outside world was a vast, frozen darkness, but inside, the faint orange light from the hearth cast soft shadows on the walls. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of straw, and every slow, steady breath of the family created a quiet symphony of warmth and safety. With the home fully secured, the family could finally prepare to rest, protected from the bitter wind that prowled just beyond the door. With the home secured and darkness fully settled outside, medieval peasants turned their attention to one of the most delicate tasks of the night, preparing the fire so it would survive until morning. This wasn't merely a chore. It was a nightly ritual that balanced patience, skill, and the quiet hope that the coming dawn wouldn't arrive to a cold, lifeless hearth. The fire had burned brightly during the evening meal, filling the room with warmth and soft light. But now the flames needed to be tamed. Letting the fire roar through the night would burn too much wood, an impossible luxury. Yet allowing it to die completely meant facing a freezing house at dawn and the difficult task of starting from scratch. So the family turned to the practice that generations before them had relied on, banking the fire. One person, often the most experienced in the household, knelt beside the hearth. The glowing embers were gently rearranged with a metal rod or sturdy stick, bringing the hottest coals into a tight cluster at the center. Their soft red glow pulsed like a quiet heartbeat under a layer of rising smoke. Next came the ash. Ash was more than the remains of yesterday's fire. It was insulation. With slow, careful motions, a thin blanket of ash was pulled over the embers. Too little ash, and the coals would burn too quickly. Too much, and the fire would suffocate. But when covered just right, the embers would slumber through the night, protected and preserved until morning. As the ash settled, the fire dimmed from bright orange to a soft, gentle red. The flame shrank into tiny flickers, then disappeared entirely, leaving behind a steady warmth hidden beneath the ashen layer. It was a small miracle of winter living. Heat without flame, hidden yet alive. A single small log or a piece of peat might be set nearby, close enough to catch the slow warmth of the embers, but far enough not to burn too quickly. By dawn, it would be ready to ignite with just a breath of fresh air and a few careful pokes. Children watched the process with quiet curiosity. They knew that someday they would be the ones performing this ritual, passing down the same ancient technique that kept their ancestors alive through countless winters. Tonight, they simply observed the dance of hands and ash, the gentle movements that seemed almost magical. When the fire was finally settled, a sense of calm filled the home. The hearth no longer glowed brightly, but it radiated a subtle, comforting heat, just enough to keep the cold at bay. The faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of straw and wool, creating an atmosphere that felt both humble and safe. Outside, the wind whispered softly against the house, brushing past the patched walls and shuttered window openings. But inside, the quiet glow of the banked fire promised warmth, hope, and an unbroken thread connecting the family to the coming morning. With the heart prepared, the family could finally turn their thoughts toward rest. With the fire safely banked and the last preparations for the night complete, medieval families settled into a familiar and essential part of winter survival, arranging themselves for sleep. It wasn't as simple as choosing a comfortable spot. Every sleeping position, every shared blanket, and every inch of space played a role in keeping the cold at bay. The sleeping area was usually a single corner of the home, warmed by the faint heat from the hearth. Straw was spread across the floor or packed into a rough mattress, forming a layer of insulation between the family and the frozen earth beneath. It wasn't soft, but it was warmer than bare ground, and that made all the difference. As the family gathered around this shared bed of straw, they settled into a practice arrangement. Children nestled in the center, where the combined warmth of others could shield them from drafts. The elderly were placed close to the fire's lingering heat, their frilier bodies wrapped in whatever spare layers the family could spare. Stronger adults formed the outer ring, acting as protective walls against the night's chill. Blankets, or whatever passed them, were spread over the group. Some were patched pieces of wool, others thick cloaks, and sometimes even animal hides softened from years of use. These coverings were layered carefully, trapping pockets of body heat beneath them. Every scrap of fabric mattered. Nothing was wasted. As people settled in, the rustling of straw filled the room, mingled with quiet murmurs and the occasional soft laugh. Despite the hardships of winter, these moments of closeness brought a gentle sense of comfort. The warmth shared between family members was more than physical. It was a reminder that they faced a harsh world together. Livestock inside the home also found their resting places. A cow shifted heavily in its corner, exhaling a warm breath that drifted gently across the room. Goats curled up near the walls, and chickens perched in rafters or corners, feathers fluffed against the cold. Their presence added warm sound and a strange but familiar companionship. Once everyone had settled, the room fell into a peaceful quiet. The only light came from the soft glow of the sleeping embers under their ash covering. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving faintly with every flicker of hidden heat. Breathing slowed. The cold outside pressed silently against the house. But inside, the air felt warm compared to the frozen darkness beyond the door. The rhythm of shared sleep, steady, slow, and deeply human, filled the room like a low, comforting hum. In these moments, survival was not just a struggle. It was a shared ritual of warmth, resilience, and togetherness. And as the winter night deepened, The family drifted into slumber, protected by layers of straw, blankets, and the quiet strength of each other. As the family drifted into uneasy sleep, the long winter night stretched out before them, cold, silent, and demanding. But in medieval homes, not everyone slept at once. A quiet, unspoken system existed, one born from necessity rather than choice, sleeping in shifts. After an hour or two, when the first group had warmed themselves under blankets and straw, someone gently stirred. It might be an older child, a parent, or a grandparent whose light sleep made them a reliable watcher. They rose slowly, careful not to disturb the tightly packed sleepers around them, and made their way toward the hearth. The room was dim, lit only by the faint red glow beneath the ash-covered embers. The watcher crouched beside the fire, lifting a handful of ash and brushing it gently aside to check the heat beneath. Still alive, still warm, a small swell of relief washed over them. Even in the quiet, the room felt full. The slow breathing of the family, the soft shifting of animals, and the faint crackle of settling wood all blended into a peaceful, rhythmic sound. Outside, however, the world was entirely different, cold, sharp, and whispering with wind that slipped along the walls, searching for a way in. The watcher added a tiny bit of fuel, not enough to disrupt the banking process, just enough to keep the ember bed healthy. A few dried twigs, perhaps, or a pinch of peat. This careful tending was essential. Without it, the fire might fade too much, leaving the family to wake in a house colder than ice. When the embers settled again, the watcher stood quietly and listened. Listening was part of the duty, listening for wildlife that might come too close, for the shift of the thatched roof under heavy snow, or for a sudden draft that signaled a gap in the wall. In the dark, senses grew sharper, and even the faintest sound felt significant. Sometimes, while the fire watcher worked, they wrapped themselves in an old cloak or fur to guard against the chill. They might pull the fabric to their face, breathing slowly through it to warm the air before it reached their lungs. The stillness of the moment made the cloak feel heavier, like a mantle of responsibility being worn for just a few hours. When their time was done, they gently nudged the next person awake. A soft shake, a whispered name, a quiet exchange of tired smiles. The next guardian rose, slipping into the same rhythm without complaint. It wasn't a burden. It was a shared understanding. Everyone played a part because survival depended on it. The person who had finished their turn returned to the straw bedding, easing themselves back into the communal warmth. They nestled between family members, feeling the comfort of shared heat, and slowly drifted back to sleep under the muted glow of the hearth's slumbering embers. Outside, winter remained harsh and unyielding. But inside the home, shift by shift, ember by ember, the family held the darkness at bay. Throughout the long hours of night, the cold outside crept closer, pressing against the thin walls like an unwelcome visitor determined to slip inside. And while the sleeping shifts continued, medieval peasants relied on another subtle but vital survival technique: controlling how they breathed. In the dim glow of the hearth's resting embers, each sleeper instinctively drew slow, shallow breaths. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was something learned over generations, passed down quietly from parent to child. Breathe gently through the nose, not the mouth. Inhaling too deeply or gulping down icy air could send a sharp, painful chill straight into the chest. An easy path to illness in a world without doctors or medicine. Even asleep, the body adjusted. Instead of large breaths that filled the room with mist, The air flowed softly in and out, warmed slightly by lingering heat under the blankets. The little ones sometimes burrowed deeper into cloaks or straw, their faces half covered, so that every breath warmed the fabric, and the fabric warmed them in return. A few family members instinctively pulled scarves or bits of wool over their mouths as they slept, creating a small pocket of warm air. The cloth grew damp with breath, but stayed useful, a simple barrier between fragile lungs and the freezing night. Those awake on fire-watching duty understood this well. When they stepped away from the warmth of the shared bedding, the cold air hit them sharply. Their first breath always stung a little, so they raised a sleeve or a corner of their cloak over their mouth before inhaling again. Every breath had to be treated like something delicate, slow, steady, and carefully warmed. The animals inside the home understood this in their own quiet way. The cow's breath puffed out in soft, steady waves, warming the air around its corner. Goats slept with noses tucked beneath their bodies. Even chickens kept their beaks nestled into their feathers, breathing their own tiny pockets of heated air. The silence inside the house made these small breaths noticeable. If one listened closely, the night was filled with gentle symphony, the steady rhythm of humans and animals breathing together, the soft rustling of straw beneath shifting limbs, and the distant whisper of winter wind outside, unable to cross the barrier of warmth they had created. And though it seemed like such a small thing, just breathing carefully, it meant everything. In the coldest months, it was one more line of defense, one more act of quiet resilience, one more way the peasants refused to surrender to the winter lurking just beyond the door. Wrapped in blankets, sharing body heat, breathing slowly into the still air of the room, the family held on to warmth not just with fire or straw, but with every breath they took. As the night deepened and the cold wrapped itself tightly around the world outside, medieval families relied on yet another quiet strategy to keep themselves warm: going to bed on a full stomach. It was a simple idea, but in winter, it made a powerful difference. Earlier in the evening, when the stew simmered and the bread warmed near the fire, the family ate more than just to satisfy hunger. They ate to create warmth from within. Food, especially the heavy, hearty kind, acted like a small, glowing fire inside the body. And during winter nights, when temperatures dipped lower and lower, that internal warmth could mean the difference between a comfortable sleep and shivering awake in the dark. The meals weren't fancy. Most nights, they consisted of thick vegetable stews, dense porridge, or bread softened in broth. But what these dishes lacked in elegance, they made up for in warmth and nourishment. The body worked hard to digest them, releasing heat slowly throughout the night. Children were gently encouraged to finish every bite, even if they grimaced at another bowl of turnip or cabbage stew. Parents knew that a child who went to bed hungry would be a child who woke up cold. And cold, in a medieval winter, was not something anyone could afford. After eating, a pleasant heaviness settled into the room. People stretched their limbs near the fire, feeling warm from belly to fingertips. The heat from the food mixed with the heat from the hearth, wrapping the family in a comforting drowsiness. Even the animals benefited. Pigs, goats, and cows were fed before nightfall, their full bellies helping them stay warm to the long hours ahead. Sometimes, when food was plentiful after a festival or a good harvest, a small piece of salted meat or a chunk of cheese might be added to the evening meal. These rare additions were treasures, offering extra strength and warmth. Families cherished such nights. knowing they boosted the chances of sleeping well despite the cold pressing against the walls. Of course, eating heavily before bed had its quirks. Dreams became more vivid, sometimes strange or colorful, shaped by a full stomach working hard to the dark hours. But even unusual dreams were better than waking to frozen fingers or chattering teeth. As the family settled down onto their straw bedding, the warmth from a meal lingered inside them. It blended with shared body heat, layered blankets, and the faint glow of the bank fire. Together, these elements formed a protective cocoon against winter's bitter breath. Wrapped in this mixture of warmth, both external and internal, the family drifted towards sleep, grateful for the strength that a simple bowl of stew could give on the coldest nights of the year. As the coldest nights settled heavily over medieval homes, families relied not just on fire and food, but on simple, clever tools to bring a little extra warmth into their sleeping spaces. Two of the most trusted helpers were the humble hay box and the heated stone, modest inventions that made winter a bit more bearable. Earlier in the evening, after supper had been cooked, the hay box came into use. It wasn't much to look at, just a sturdy wooden box filled with thick layers of hay, but its purpose was almost magical. Food that had been warmed over the fire could be placed inside and covered by the hay, which trapped the heat surprisingly well. Hours later, when someone grew hungry again, the meal inside was still warm, without needing to rekindle the fire. But the hay box had another trick. Families discovered that it could do more than keep dinner warm. It could keep them warm. Once the food was removed, a heated stone from the hearth took its place. Earlier, someone had carefully placed a flat stone directly into the fire, letting it heat slowly until it glowed with silent intensity. When it was hot enough, the stone was pulled out with tongs or a sturdy stick. It was always a tense moment. The line between useful warmth and dangerous heat was thin. The hot stone was wrapped in cloth or slipped into a clay pot before being nestled into the hay box. The hay insulated it perfectly, holding the heat and releasing it slowly, like a gentle, steady breath of warmth that would last deep into the night. When it was time to sleep, the warm stone was retrieved and placed at the foot of the straw bed or slid between the layers of blankets. The moment it touched the bedding, the cold straw softened and the chill that clung to the blankets melted away. For a little while, at least, it felt like sinking into a cozy pocket of warmth, a rare luxury during brutal winters. Children especially delighted in these warm stones. They pressed their hands against them, giggling softly at the heat that seeped into their fingers. Adults were more cautious, checking to ensure the stone wasn't too hot before placing it near the bedding. Too much heat could scorch the straw, or worse, start a fire. But with careful handling, the stone became a trusted companion through the frozen hours. Sometimes families tucked smaller stones into their cloaks or blankets, creating tiny islands of warmth that made the night more bearable. The stones cooled slowly, giving off a comforting heat long after the fire had quieted. Outside, the night remained sharp and merciless. Frost formed along rooftops, and the wind scraped against the walls with icy fingers. But inside, the glow of heated stone held beneath hay or blankets offered a fragile but precious shield against the cold. It wasn't grand and it wasn't perfect, but in the darkest hours of winter, even a small pocket of warmth could feel like a blessing. Even as the heated stones warmed the bedding and the family settled into their nightly positions, there was still one final task that shaped how medieval peasants slept: deciding who would sleep closest to the fading fire. This wasn't about comfort or personal preference. It was a carefully considered choice rooted in survival. The hearth, even when banked under ash, remained the strongest source of warmth in the home. Its heat didn't travel far, but the little that reached across the room could make a significant difference for those most vulnerable to winter's bite. So the sleeping arrangements followed a gentle, unspoken order. Infants were placed nearest to the fire. Their tiny bodies couldn't retain heat the way adults could, and even a mild chill could be dangerous. Parents tucked them into the warmest spot, often holding them close or wrapping them in the softest fabrics available. The heart's gentle warmth became a protective shield for these youngest members of the family. Beside them rested the elderly, those whose bones had grown brittle with age, whose joints stiffened painfully in the cold. Placing them near the fire wasn't just an act of kindness. It was essential. The warmth eased their discomfort, soothed their breathing, and helped them withstand the long hours of icy darkness outside. Sick or weakened family members were given space in this inner circle as well. A place close to the hearth offered a better chance of seeing the next sunrise. In a world without medicine, warmth itself was a kind of healing. The adults who were strongest, those who spent their days working in fields chopping wood or tending livestock, formed the next layer, creating a protective ring around the most fragile. They didn't complain. They understood their role and accepted it with quiet pride. Their broad backs and thicker cloaks were shields against drafts that slipped through the walls. Children old enough to manage the cold slept near these adults, still close enough to benefit from the shared warmth, but not quite in the central circle. Even livestock sometimes pressed closer to this group. Dogs curled by their feet, goats shifted against their sides, their breaths adding a little extra heat to the room. Of course, sleeping next to the fire wasn't without risks. Sparks could jump unexpectedly. Logs might shift. The heat could sometimes feel too strong, causing a restless night. But compared to freezing temperatures everywhere else, the hearth's risk seemed small and entirely worth taking. As everyone settled into their places, the room became a layered arrangement of warmth, like rings of protection radiating outward from the heart of the home. The fire glowed softly beneath its coating of ash, casting faint light that danced on the walls and outlined the peaceful shapes of those sleeping nearby. In this carefully arranged closeness, the family found not only warmth, but security. Each person played a part. Each position had purpose, and together they form a living barrier against the cold waiting silently beyond the walls. In the depths of winter, warmth was never truly guaranteed, no matter how carefully the fire was tended or how tightly the family huddled together. That's why medieval villagers leaned on something just as important as heat: each other. Community wasn't just a pleasant idea during winter, it was a lifeline. Long before night fell, every villager silently took note of the smoke rising from neighboring chimneys. It wasn't nosy curiosity, it was survival. A steady column of smoke meant a steady fire. No smoke meant danger. If one household's fire went out in the middle of winter, it wasn't a private problem. It became everyone's concern. A dark chimney could mean a family was freezing, sick, or unable to ignite a new flame. And in a small village, losing even one family weakened the entire community. So, even late into the night, when the rest of the world seemed locked in winter's icy fist, there were people who remained quietly alert. Someone might step outside, just long enough to glance down the lane. Someone else might pause before sleep to listen for unusual stillness. Too much quiet could be a sign of trouble. When suspicion arose, Villagers acted quickly. A neighbor might arrive at the door carrying a glowing ember wrapped in rags, its faint heat guarded like treasure. Another might offer a place by their own hearth, squeezing a family into an already crowded home, because warmth shared was warmth multiplied. Inside these homes, space was always tight. Extra bodies meant less room to move, more noise, and an even stronger smell of smoke and animals. But complaints were rare. Everyone understood one truth deeply. Winter didn't care who suffered. It would take anyone left alone. Food was sometimes shared too, even when there wasn't much to spare. A bowl of porridge, a portion of stew, a chunk of coarse bread. Small offerings that spoke volumes. No one had abundance, but everyone had responsibility. Giving someone a meal was giving them strength. Giving them strength was giving them survival. Children joined in this unspoken pact of care. They were often sent ahead with small bundles of wood or a handful of straw for bedding. Their tiny footprints dotted snowy paths between homes, little reminders that the future generation already understood the value of watching over one another. The elderly played their part as well. Though they no longer worked the fields, they kept careful eyes on the patterns of winter, how the wind blew, how cold nights became, whose house looked the most fragile beneath the weight of the snow. Their wisdom guided when and how the village acted. Even old quarrels softened during winter. A neighbor who argued about grazing land in the summer might be the same one who brought fresh embers in January. Survival had a way of teaching forgiveness, or at least temporary peace. And so, night after night, the village held itself together like a woven blanket. Each household a thread, each ember a light of hope. In a season that tested every limit, it was their shared warmth, shared vigilance, and shared humanity that kept them alive. As the night wore on and the cold wrapped itself tighter around the village, medieval families turned to something far beyond fire, food, or warm stones. Faith. In the quiet, dim glow of their homes, belief became a shelter of its own, offering comfort when the world outside felt vast, dark, and unforgiving. Winter brought dangers that no one could fully control. Illness, hunger, storms, and the bitter cold that seeped through walls no matter how carefully they were patched. And so, before sleep took them, many families knelt beside their straw bedding or sat close to the hearth and whispered simple prayers into the smoky air. Their voices were soft, unhurried, barely more than breath. They asked for protection through the night, for warmth to stay with them, for the fire to burn gently until morning. They prayed for the health of children, the strength of elders, and the safety of their livestock, precious companions whose survival meant everything. Certain saints became familiar friends during these long nights. Saint Blaise was remembered for guarding against throat ailments, a constant worry in freezing temperatures. Saint Nicholas was called upon not for gifts, but for protection and mercy in times of hardship. And in the deepest cold, some murmur the names of saints believed to shield homes from misfortune. Superstitions wove themselves into these rituals. A bowl of water might be sprinkled lightly near the hearth, or a candle, blessed earlier in the year, might be lit for just a moment before being carefully snuffed to save precious wax. A small charm hung from a beam, or a cross etched into the wooden doorframe, gave the family a sense of invisible protection. Even children joined these routines. Their prayers were simple, often just a few earnest lines, but their sincerity filled the room with a gentle hope. Parents listened quietly, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, The sound of prayer mingled with the soft crackle of the banked embers and the gentle shifting of animals settling in for the night. It created a kind of peaceful rhythm, a quiet lullaby of faith and survival. Some nights, especially in harsh weather, families prayed longer than usual. They asked for roofs to hold strong under heavy snow, for wandering wolves to stay far from their doors, for sickness to pass them by. In a world where so much felt unpredictable, these whisper hopes anchored them. When the prayers were finished, a hush followed, a calm acceptance that they had done everything they could. The rest was left to fate, to the fire, and to the warmth of their tightly gathered bodies. Slowly, the family lay down again. Blankets rustled softly. Straw settled beneath them, and the faintest glow from the hearth cast a warm shimmer across tired faces. The cold outside deepened, but inside, their faith wrapped around them like another layer of protection. And with that final comfort, they closed their eyes, trusting that morning would come. Even with all their careful preparation, the banked fire, the shared warmth, the whispered prayers, medieval families live with a harsh truth. Sometimes, winter's grip was simply too strong. No matter how resilient or resourceful they were, nature could still overtake them. This quiet reality lingered in the background of every cold night. Some winters were remembered long after they passed, spoken of in hushed tones years later. During these brutal seasons, storms came one after another, crops failed, and food stores shrank faster than anyone expected. In such winters, even the strongest families felt the uncertainty settle into their bones. The cold showed no mercy. If the fire died unexpectedly during the night, waking up became a dangerous challenge. A house without heat could cool shockingly fast, turning the small home into a silent trap of frost and breathless air. If someone fell ill, a cough, a fever, a chill, the lack of warmth made recovery fragile, sometimes impossible. Villagers knew of stories where entire families huddled together until the very end, found in the spring still wrapped in each other's arms, as if united strength could hold back the winter just a little longer. These tales were heartbreaking, but they were also reminders of how fiercely people fought against the cold. Heavy snow could collapse a roof overnight, burying belongings and leaving a home too damaged to offer shelter. Walking through deep snow to seek help was dangerous, especially in the pitch darkness of a winter storm. People sometimes set out with hope, only to vanish into the white blur. When the world thawed, neighbors would finally learn their fate. Hunger was another relentless foe. When food ran low, people rationed every crumb. Bowls of thin broth became nightly meals. Fathers slipped to the cold at dawn to search for anything edible. Roots hidden beneath the frost, bits of dried forage, anything that could stretch the pantry just a little longer. Still, there were nights when stomachs rumbled loudly in the quiet darkness. And then there was frostbite. It crept into fingers, toes, and ears without warning. By the faint light of morning, someone might discover that a hand no longer responded, or that their toes were stiff and darkened. Those who survived harsh winters often carried as marks a missing fingertip, stiff joints, or scars that lasted a lifetime. Yet, despite the dangers, despite the losses, people kept going. They patched roofs after storms, strengthened walls with whatever scraps they had, and shared what little they could with neighbors. Even when winter took more than anyone thought they could bear, life edged forward. One ember, one meal, one prayer at a time. And when spring finally arrived, slowly, gently, like a long-awaited promise, The relief was overwhelming. Birds returned. The air softened. Snow melted into the earth, leaving behind a sense of renewal that made all the suffering feel, if not forgotten, at least survivable. For medieval peasants, winter was never guaranteed, but their endurance, quiet, determined, and often invisible, was nothing short of remarkable. As the first pale hint of dawn touched the edge of the sky, medieval families stirred gently from their uneasy sleep. The night's cold still clung to the air, heavy and unmoving, but inside the small home, there was something stronger than the frost. The quiet determination to begin another day. Waking in winter wasn't like waking in warmer seasons. There was no sudden burst of energy, no brightness to greet them, only the soft crackle of the bank fire and the slow realization that morning had arrived. Body stiff from sleeping on straw, took a moment to stretch. Layers of blankets were peeled back carefully, releasing little clouds of warm breath into the chill of the room. The person closest to the hearth rose first. They knelt beside the ashes, brushing aside the top layer with gentle hands. If fortune and skill had worked together through the night, a faint glow still flickered beneath. When they saw that soft red ember, a small wave of relief warmed the room more than the fire itself. With practiced motions, they added a few dry twigs, blowing softly until the embers brightened, awakening into small flames. The family watched as those tiny sparks grew, their orange light creeping across the walls like a quiet sunrise inside the home. If the embers had survived, it meant the day could begin smoothly. But if the hearth had gone cold, if no glow remained beneath the ash, the morning became far more urgent. Someone would need to hurry to a neighbor's home, carrying a small pot or wrap cloth to borrow spark or ember. No one refused such a request. The entire village knew how precious a warm hearth was on a winter morning. As the fire strengthened, the family slowly rose to their feet. Children rubbed their eyes, still wrapped in bits of wool or old cloaks. The elderly moved carefully, joints stiff from the night's cold. Animals stretched as well, cows shifting heavily, goats rising with quiet bleats, chickens shaking frost from their feathers. The new fire brought movement and life back into the home. A pot was placed over flames to warm water for washing or breakfast. Bread left near the hearth overnight softened, and porridge was stirred slowly, steam curling upward in soft ribbons. Outside, the frost lay thick across the village. Roofs sparkled like they were dusted with crystals, and the air still held the deep silence of early morning. But thin trails of smoke began rising from homes one by one. Proof that families were waking, fires were returning, and another day of winter survival had officially begun. In that fragile morning light, peasants didn't think about how many more cold days lay ahead. They focused on the tasks of the moment, rekindling the fire, warming the room, feeding the animals, preparing breakfast. Each small step was a victory, a gentle act of resilience. And as warmth slowly filled the home again, the family gathered close, grateful for one simple truth. They had made it through another night. As the morning fire grew stronger in a home filled with gentle, rising warmth, medieval families stepped into the new day carrying not just relief, but something deeper, a quiet strength shaped by every winter night they had endured. Surviving winter wasn't just about making it to the cold. It was about building a spirit that refused to break, even when the world outside seemed frozen and still. Medieval peasants didn't have grand comforts. They didn't have thick blankets stitched with feathers, warm shoes lined with fur, or strong homes that kept out every draft. They had simple huts, scratchy wool, smoky hearths, and straw beds. Yet from these humble things, they created a life filled with determination and resourcefulness. Every small act, stuffing gaps in the walls, banking the fire, sharing blankets, breathing slowly to warm the air, sleeping close to one another, became part of an unspoken wisdom passed through generations. These weren't just survival tricks. They were gestures of hope, signs that people could adapt to even the harshest conditions. Communities supported one another not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. A shared ember, a bowl of stew, a helping hand on a stormy night. These simple exchanges kept entire villages alive. And in those moments, peasants learned that hardship could knit people together more tightly than comfort ever could. Their faith, too, played a quiet role. They prayed not for riches or miracles, but for strength, warm health, and safe passage through the darkest nights. And whether through belief, tradition, or sheer perseverance, these prayers helped them face challenges that would have overwhelmed many. The frozen months tested every part of their lives. Winter took energy, food, time, and sometimes even the people they loved most. But instead of giving in, peasants found ways to endure, patching, repairing, sharing, adapting, and pushing forward one careful step at a time. And though winter often felt endless, it never truly was. Eventually, the frost loosened its grip. Days grew brighter. Snow softened. Birds returned, singing their first hopeful notes of the new season. The villagers felt their spirits lift as the earth thawed beneath their feet. The hardships of winter left their mark, of course, on their bodies, their memories, their stories. But those marks were reminders of their resilience, proof that even without wealth or luxury, they possessed something far more valuable, the stubborn, unwavering will to survive. So, when we look back on medieval peasants today, it's easy to see only the difficulties, the cold nights, the thin meals, the smoky air. But beneath all of that lived a quiet, powerful endurance. Their strength wasn't loud or heroic. It was steady, patient, persistent. It grew from necessity, but it shaped the generations that followed. Because of them, because of every fire they kept alive, every night they endured, we enjoy comforts they could only dream of. Warm homes, soft blankets, full meals, safety from the cold. Their resilience lives on in us, even if we rarely notice it. And in every warm room on a winter night, in every peaceful sleep where frost cannot reach us, there's a small echo of their hard-won legacy, a reminder of the countless brave hearts who kept going one ember at a time.